It was a week or two before Christmas, about 3 years ago. I lived alone in a single family home, and living in the north, winters get pretty brutal here. I was glad to be off work this day, because the blizzard that came through was wild. Almost 3 feet of snow. I stayed in all day, of course. It got even worse at night, but I was cozy and I ended up just grabbing a few blankets and falling asleep on the couch downstairs while watching TV and listening to the wind outside. I slept like a rock for a couple of hours, a good 2 or 3 I'd say, before I jolted awake. I was really confused for a second because I felt like I heard light knocking, but also felt like it was part of a dream I was having. Now that I was fully awake, though, I didn't hear anything. I brushed it off and sat up, figuring I should probably just head upstairs while I was up. I shut everything off and walked toward the stairs, but as I passed by the front door, I got this feeling that I should check just in case. I looked out the peephole at first, but it was blocked by snow or ice, so then I opened the door. No one was there. However, in the thick snow were clear signs someone had been there. Because the snow was so tall, there weren't distinct footprints, but you could tell someone had dragged their legs all the way up here, and right up to the door, and probably took the same way to leave. The conditions were full-on whiteout, so past 5 feet from the porch, I couldn't see a thing, not even the road at the end of the driveway. If someone was still out there and had just left moments ago, I didn't have a clue. I closed and locked the door. I felt really uncomfortable about it, but I think my first thought was that whoever it was might have been lost in the weather and going door to door to try and get help. Why else would anyone be out there in the middle of the night? And because they were gone, I figured they just moved on to the next home. I didn't know what else to really think or do about it. I went upstairs and got in bed. Took a bit to get myself to fall asleep, and this time I didn't wake up abruptly. However, the way I woke up was really strange. I was freezing, like full-on shivering, and it was so cold in the house that I could see my breath. I actually whispered what the hell under my breath because it didn't make any sense. My room was dark, but all the windows were closed, and obviously I'd had the heat on in the house all day and never touched it. Something had to be wrong. I checked the time and saw it was only 2 hours after I'd gone to bed. I got up and walked into the hallway. It was just as cold. I knew it was below zero outside, and I swear it had to be around 20 degrees inside, so it was painfully cold. I think I'd heard too many horror stories, because as I walked downstairs, I half expected to find the front door wide open, and wet shoe prints all over the house. But I didn't. It was closed, and there were no signs of anyone breaking in. I hurried to the thermostat that was right in the front hallway. I stared at it for a moment. The physical dial was set to off, which I was 100% sure I didn't do, but also the screen wouldn't even turn on. Every possibility ran through my head in that moment. I just couldn't understand that if this was an intruder, where were they? And why mess with the thermostat? I was scared, and really wasn't sure if I should check the house or call the cops. I know it sounds silly, but I knew if I called the cops and it turned out no one else was here, I'd look insane. I decided to at least go back upstairs to get my phone. I quickly started walking to the stairs, and just when I got to the bottom, I heard a sound behind me. I knew that exact sound the instant I heard it. It was the couch. It always made that same squeaking sound anytime you moved on it. I froze, then turned around. I took a couple steps, just enough so I could lean my body around the corner and look into the living room. What I saw was the most disturbing image that I still can't get out of my head. There was a man sitting right on the couch, facing forward, but his head was turned and looking at me. It was dark, but his eyes were wide and lifeless, and he was smiling. Not some over-the-top, teethy grin, but just enough to know this guy was crazy. He didn't really react to seeing me either. He stayed sitting and looking at me, not saying anything or even so much as blinking, just holding a stare. I honestly can't even remember how long I stood there in absolute terror before I ran upstairs. I got on the phone with the police immediately and locked myself in the bedroom. Only 30 seconds later, I started hearing footsteps coming up the stairs, then down the hallway. I saw his shadow move right behind the door. He knocked 3 times on the door, very slowly, like he was taunting me. Then he walked back toward the stairs, and I couldn't hear anything after that. What was so terrifying was this guy clearly wasn't normal, so I had no idea what he was going to do next. I stayed locked up in my room, waiting and freezing, for almost 20 minutes before the police made it, and the guy was already gone. There were no more tracks in the snow, so it looked like he probably left out the front door, which is also where the police think he got in from. I didn't remember whether or not I'd used the bolt lock. I know I used the main door lock on the handle, but if that was the case, police seemed to think he picked the lock to get in. To me, this feels hard to believe, though. He didn't look like he was mentally well enough to be capable of picking a lock, but maybe it's easier than I think. I don't know what insane plan he had next, or why he was acting the way he was. From his smile, the whole thermostat thing, and even the knocks on my door, it's even more creepy and disturbing, knowing he was basically playing with me. I hope it was just some freak, unlucky incident that never comes to anything else, but I'll probably never stop losing sleep over the unsettling look on his face when I found him sitting on the couch. Christmas of 2019 was the year me and my 2 best friends, Mark and Tyler, decided to rent a cabin instead of doing the usual family stuff. We were all in our early 20s, living far from our families, all kind of burnt out from work, and honestly the idea of lying around for a few days doing absolutely nothing sounded perfect. The cabin we found was about an hour outside of town, tucked halfway in the woods, but still technically in a neighborhood, if 10 other cabins spaced a mile apart counts as one. We got there on Christmas Eve, bringing tons of food, snacks, and beer, and Mark even brought over his Xbox. So we drank and played video games until 2 in the morning. It wasn't exactly a Hallmark holiday, but it was definitely fun. By the time we all went to our rooms to go to bed, I passed out almost immediately. The place was freezing, and the cabin creaked like every other old wooden building, but I was tired enough that none of it mattered, at least until I woke up. It was probably 3 or 4 in the morning, still pitch black outside. I didn't know what time it was exactly, but I knew I'd been asleep for a while, and that something woke me up. Soft, slow footsteps from the main living area. Not walking normally, more like someone taking careful steps, trying not to wake anyone. I blinked a few times, half asleep, and figured it had to be one of the guys, maybe getting water or using the bathroom. I laid there listening, waiting for the footsteps to go down the hall or to the bathroom door. But the sound just stayed in the same area, the creaking boards near the front of the cabin, almost pacing. I wanted to call out and ask if everything was okay, but I didn't feel like yelling from a dark room or going out there and startling them. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. The cabin settled back into silence. I rolled over and fell asleep again. When I finally got up in the morning, sunlight was coming in through the big living room windows, and the guys were already in the living room. First thing I did was jokingly ask who was creeping around at 4 in the morning. I expected some stupid answer from one of them about losing their phone while drunk or something. I don't know. But both of them gave me the exact same confused look. Mark said, "Dude, we all went to bed at 2. And Tyler shook his head, saying he didn't get up once. I laughed it off at first. I figured maybe I'd imagined it, or dreamed the sound and mistaken it as real. But then I glanced over toward the front door. The lock was undone. Not just the deadbolt, the handle lock too, fully unlocked. The door was still shut, but the locks weren't turned. I asked if either of them had gone outside this morning. They both said no, and when I pointed out the door, I saw both of their faces fall flat, as we all kind of realized I might have actually heard someone last night. I mean, we were all fairly sure that we had locked the door. But after a minute of thinking about it, Tyler said maybe the wind shook it loose, or maybe the old door just didn't latch right. You know, the usual excuses people make when they don't want to consider anything else. I think it was because all of us wanted to believe that it was nothing, that we eventually just let it go. We ate breakfast, bundled up in our winter coats because it was still absolutely freezing in the cabin, and spent the afternoon hanging around, playing video games, watching movies, and just having a good time. We also handed out small crappy gifts we'd gotten each other for Christmas, and spent some time FaceTiming our families. It was snowing too much, and way too cold to spend any time outside, even though we all had wanted to go hiking while we were up at the cabin. Over the course of the day, the whole creaking and unlocked door incident faded into just an odd mystery. But as it got later, I guess I started to get a weird gut feeling. We were all in the living room, playing some dumb party game on the Xbox, laughing and yelling at each other. And every so often, I'd catch myself glancing toward the window. I hadn't noticed it much before, but now the blackness outside felt too close. Like someone standing just a few feet back could watch us clearly, while we'd never see them. I knew during the day there were some trees just outside of that window, like literally 10 feet away, and yet it was too dark to even see that. I didn't want to mention the bad feeling I had because I didn't want to kill the mood, especially when I really didn't have a reason to feel the way I did. I never actually saw anything. Because we had stayed up so late last night, we only stayed up until around 12 a.m. when Mark decided to head to bed early. Me and Tyler stayed in the living room for another 30 minutes chatting before both also going to bed. I laid in bed awake for a while. Hard to tell the time just sitting there, but it felt like an hour-ish. There were no curtains or blinds, so the window next to my bed made me feel really uneasy. And then I heard it again. The soft, quiet footsteps at the front of the cabin in the living room. I sat up and listened as intently as I could. I knew this time that it wasn't one of my friends, because I would have heard them leave their rooms and walk down the hallway. So really, I was just listening to see if it was just the house creaking, or if it was actually a person. And after a while of listening, I was absolutely sure that what I was hearing were footsteps, and with whoever it was just pacing around the room, I finally decided to get up and maybe try confronting them. But as I walked over to the bedroom door, suddenly the footsteps moved from the living room to the hallway. They got closer and closer, walking all the way down, passing by my door, and going toward what I think was Mark's room. And then it was quiet. I didn't hear anything for several long seconds. I very quietly grabbed the door handle and pushed my door open just slightly enough to peek out into the hallway, not making a sound. I saw a large man, I mean like maybe 6'5" or taller, with long hair and a thick beard. He was standing still, facing Mark's bedroom door, and just standing there motionless in the dark. I didn't risk looking for too long and moved away, but left the door cracked open still because I didn't want it to make a click sound if I closed it. And at this point, I didn't know what to do. I froze up, unsure how to get us out of this situation. But just 20 seconds later, I heard a slight creak in the hallway, and before I could even react, my door was suddenly pushed open. The man stood in the doorway, staring at me with wide open eyes and an emotionless face. I yelled at the top of my lungs, and the dude didn't even flinch. Before I knew it, Mark and Tyler came running out of their rooms, and I couldn't see much, but Tyler immediately saw the guy and tried to stop him. But this dude was huge, and basically just slammed Tyler against the wall and threw him to the floor. And Mark was probably just frozen still after seeing that. But then the guy ran off, didn't try fighting all of us. He just took off out of the cabin and, from what we could tell, into the forest. We quickly locked up the place and called the police. It took over 20 minutes, and the whole time we were anticipating the man coming back. All of us were holding whatever temporary weapons we could find, like kitchen knives and the iron fireplace rod. But he didn't come back. Really, we got no answers, and most of the situation fell onto the owner of the cabin, as he was the one who had his cabin broken into. What that man wanted from us or from the cabin, we don't know. From our few theories though, the one that stands out to me is that he might have been there looking for the owner and not knowing it was a rental. It would explain him staring at me and seeing all of us and not really bothering with doing anything afterward. But again, it really is just a theory. He just as likely could have been there to harm us and just saw it was 3 people and decided to run. Whatever the case, we're all just glad it didn't come down to an all-out fight, because I genuinely don't know who would have won in the end. I had just moved into a new home in an area that I was unfamiliar with. I mean, I knew about it beforehand and had visited a few times before making the move, but I didn't really know it. From what I saw on the days I walked around and came by to check out the houses, it seemed very quiet. Not a lot of people out and about, and everyone sort of keeping to themselves. Even on move-in day, when I had the whole moving truck outside and was in and out of the house constantly, nobody came out or introduced themselves or anything. I didn't mind, I was usually the quiet neighbor anyway, but I just noticed it seemed everyone else here was the same way. Made it hard to truly tell what kind of people lived around me. This started on the second day after the move. I still hadn't started my new job yet, and was still working on getting the house organized and unpacked. I spent basically all day inside, partly because it was snowing outside, but mostly because I was stressed with all the boxes around and wanted to get it done as fast as possible. I went to bed early, around 8 or so. When I woke up, I very quickly realized it wasn't morning. I rolled over and saw it was 2 a.m. And just when I was going to question why I woke up, I heard this strange scraping sound. It was muffled and followed by an airy thump sound. Then, a few seconds later, there was a scrape, and then another thump, over and over. Eventually, I got up from bed, still having no idea what I was hearing. I walked over to the window and looked down toward the front yard of my house. There was a man in my driveway, shoveling the snow. He moved back and forth, scraping up a line of snow and tossing it off the driveway. He was covered fully in dark winter clothing, so I couldn't tell much about him. I probably stood there in the window watching him for 2 or 3 minutes. To be honest, it kind of creeped me out. I know I'd just moved there, and maybe this guy was trying to do a nice gesture for me. But at 2 a.m., and without ever even talking to me. After those few minutes, I left the window and went downstairs, putting my shoes and a jacket on, and opening the front door to introduce myself and just figure out what was going on. But when I stepped outside, he wasn't there. He had just left all of a sudden, coincidentally as soon as I left the window. And it's not even like he finished shoveling. Half of the driveway was still covered, and it looked like the man had stopped midway through shoveling a section. I stood out there and looked all around, but every house was dark, and the entire neighborhood seemed to be quiet and asleep. Noticeably, no other driveway was shoveled either. After a minute, I went back inside, got in bed, and slept until morning. I spent the whole next day inside unpacking again, half expecting that guy to show up at my door to introduce himself, but he never did. It snowed on and off that day too, covering the whole neighborhood with another blanket of snow, and honestly, I thought I would never really get an answer as to what that guy was doing. I stayed up later, now with my TV set up, but still exhausted, I went to bed around 11. And again, I woke up a little past 2 a.m. That same muffled scraping sound filled the silence. I got up and hurried to the window. It was the same man, slowly shoveling my driveway. This night, I wasted no time hurrying downstairs, getting dressed, and walking out the front door. But it was like the man knew somehow, because, again, he was gone. No signs of him anywhere. The longer I stayed outside in the cold, the more this eerie feeling crept into me. I waited 15 more minutes in case he came back, but went to bed afterward. This went on for several more days. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to that same sound, check the window and see him out there slowly, almost creepily, shoveling. I had stopped trying to go outside though, and would just try to go back to sleep instead. I didn't know what to do about it. Maybe he had some weird connection to this house, or the previous owners, or didn't even know I moved in. And despite having a really bad feeling and being creeped out, it's not like I could really call the cops about it. What would I say? Some man shows up and shovels my driveway for me every night for free. It sounds like a joke. I swear though, something about the way the man moved, and would constantly disappear when I went out there, was disturbing. I knew that something wasn't right. I think it was on the 6th day that I woke up again in the middle of the night to the same shoveling sounds outside. And despite knowing who it was and what I'd see, I still got up from the bed and walked over to the window. But just before I reached the window, the sound abruptly stopped. And when I looked out, he wasn't there. I was absolutely sure that he couldn't have run away that quickly. There was less than a second between me hearing the sound stop and me reaching the window. I knew that he was still out there, though the driveway was fully shoveled. and even after a couple of minutes, I didn't hear anything else. It was like he knew that I was at the window. Tired and frustrated, I ran downstairs, threw on my coat and boots, and swung open the front door to go look around. I almost fell backwards. The man was standing on my porch, just a foot away from the door. He was tall, holding the shovel to his side. The man had a thick, scraggly beard and shoulder-length, wet black hair, and his eyes stared at me intensely. He looked extremely sleep-deprived and sickly. I couldn't even move or speak a word for a couple of seconds, still absolutely horrified. And this absolute horror I was in only seemed to get worse when I realized he wasn't moving or speaking either. He just stood there on my porch, staring at me from a foot away. I finally controlled myself and managed to ask what he was doing. His eyes tensed even more, like they were heavier, staring into me. Then he turned and walked off the porch. I stayed in the doorway, watching him walk down to the driveway, then to the road, and seemingly continue down the road for as far as I could see. I was scared and confused and still in shock. I closed the door. This time, I really thought about calling the cops, but I knew that I'd get nothing from it. The man was already gone. I still didn't know who he was, and at the end of the day, he really hadn't done anything yet. So I'd be calling just on the feeling that this was something bad, and that something would happen, which I knew the cops wouldn't take seriously. So, again, I went back upstairs and went to bed. The next day, it didn't snow at all, and with the house all set up, I was able to relax for most of the day. I still felt uneasy about everything, and not having anyone to talk to about it and being in an area that I wasn't familiar with just made it even worse. Eventually, the sun went down and I went to bed. That night, I woke up at 2 a.m., just like all the other nights, except there weren't any sounds. My body seemed to have just been used to waking up at that time, anticipating the man shoveling outside. I laid there awake for a few minutes, listening to how eerily quiet it was. I closed my eyes and tried to fall back asleep, and that's when I heard something below me. A very quiet thump. It was so quiet, I was surprised I even heard it. And it wasn't concerning on its own. It sounded like nothing more than the house settling. But with everything else going on, and it being 2 a.m., just like all the previous nights, I felt like I had to be sure. I listened for another minute, not hearing anything more, but knew I couldn't sleep without checking. I got up and walked downstairs. My eyes were dead focused on the front door as I walked down the hallway. I got up all the way to the door, still staring at it, before I realized something was in the side of my view. I slowly turned my head toward the living room. The man was standing there in the middle of the room with his back facing me, holding the shovel. He was motionless, like he didn't know I was there, or didn't care. It was almost pitch black in that room, too, so he was just standing in the pitch dark, not moving at all. I ran back upstairs, locked myself in, and dialed 911, but the house still remained eerily silent. An officer arrived 5-ish minutes later. He found the back door open and no one else in the house with me. I explained everything, and the officer filed my report, but there was no real investigation. I don't really know why, as it was clear this man had broken in, and I had a fairly good description of him, but that was where it was all left at. I don't know what was wrong with that man, why he was doing what he was doing, or what he wanted from me. I think from the way he looked and the creepy nature of him showing up in the middle of the night every night, it was only a matter of time before things escalated even further. I had a couple friends back home mention he could have been sleepwalking because of the way I described his almost lifeless way of moving and how repetitive and consistent everything happened every single night at the same time. But I still think this is a stretch. Either way, if that was the case, it's still incredibly creepy and would have been very dangerous. If I said anything or woke him up or tried to stop him, it could have triggered violent behavior. But none of this explains how he somehow knew every time I left the window and went downstairs. Whatever was really going on, I'll never know, because I moved away a few months later. I'd been driving since early morning, trying to make it from Minneapolis to my sister's place in Montana before the weekend. It was supposed to be a quick winter trip. Just me, my old but trusty Subaru, and some crappy gas station coffee. Everything was fine until the snow started falling once I got a little further north, and into the more isolated parts of the highway. It wasn't too bad to start, just some light snowfall here and there, but it ramped up pretty quick around the time the sun went down. It became almost a wall of white that even my headlights were having trouble cutting through. After an hour of this, the road was fully covered in snow, to the point where it was really hard to tell if I was even staying on the road. With how stressful it was, I told myself I'd pull off at whatever the next place was, so I could wait out the blizzard. Once I decided that, I think it was 15 minutes later that I barely saw a light on the side of the road. It was snowing so hard I couldn't even read what it was before turning in. The parking lot was small, but had 3 cars in it. One noticeably buried in the snow, and the other 2 looked like they'd pulled in not long before me. I parked, and from there I could see from the shape and look of the building that it was some kind of roadside cafe. I was hoping for a motel, but figured if I was going to be stuck waiting here anyway, I might as well head in and grab some more coffee. I got out and walked through the blizzard. I hurried inside, nearly freezing already. This definitely wasn't the kind of place I was used to, or ever been to before, being a city person, so I felt very out of place. It was a very small, old-fashioned cafe with a bar near the front. 2 men were sitting there with coffee, and 1 woman working behind the counter. When I opened the door, though, it was very quiet inside. None of them were talking or anything. However, they all looked over at me and greeted me right away. Felt like I walked in during an awkward silence or something. I thought I was just overthinking it, though. I sat next to the men. Turned out both the guys had the same idea as me, pulling in to escape the blizzard. I ordered a coffee from the woman working there and took the mug over to a seat by the front window, watching the snow continue coming down outside and covering our cars. I also had a weird feeling about one of the men over at the bar. He was older, maybe 50, and the best way I could describe him is that he looked half dead. I don't know if it was from the weather or boredom, or if he was just having a bad day. Strangely, after I left and sat at the window, all the conversation stopped again, and the place was quiet, just like it had been when I first walked in. We all sort of sat there in silence for a few minutes, before suddenly one of the men got up and said something about trying to reach his nearby cabin before the roads get closed. Nobody else said anything. I watched him through the window, walking out to his car and getting in. He sat inside there for a minute, probably waiting for it to warm up. Then the other guy also got up and, without saying anything, left the cafe. I moved from the window back to the bar, immediately asking the worker what was up with those guys. She shrugged, saying they pulled in around the same time and looked like they were arguing in the parking lot before coming inside. From there, they didn't say much of anything. Figured it was just road rage or something like that. I stayed at the bar for a while, talking to her about the blizzard and just a bunch of small talk. Over those 30 minutes, nobody else walked into the cafe. Eventually, I made my way back to the window to check on the snow and see if it had settled a bit. That's when I saw both of the men's cars still there. However, neither of them were inside the cars or outside the cars. They were just gone. This immediately sent a chill through me because it had been a while since they left the building. No way they were out in the blizzard for that long. I went over to the front door for a closer look, then decided to take a few steps out and look around. The sharp cold instantly hit my face, and the snow, while not as bad as before, still made it difficult to see. Aside from the harsh winds, it was quiet out there. No signs of either of the men. It actually gave me a really uneasy feeling, to the point where I wanted to leave. I dragged my legs through the snow to my car. Plan was to turn it on and let it warm up while I waited back inside before leaving. But it wouldn't start. Not like it was struggling to start, though. It wouldn't even turn on in the slightest, or make any sounds when I turned the key. It had only been maybe 40 minutes since I'd arrived at the cafe, and my car hadn't had a single issue before this night. My gut knew one of the men had something to do with this. I know maybe at this point that sounds crazy, like I was being over-skeptical from the jump, but I just knew it somehow. And then, as I sat in the seat, still trying to get it to turn on, I saw someone. One of the men walking out of the woods behind the cafe. He wasn't much more than a dark figure covered by the darkness and the blizzard of snowfall, but he was heading back toward the cars. I quickly got out and rushed inside, turning the lock on the front door. The woman asked me why I did that and what was going on, to which I quickly explained and told her to call 911. She seemed unsure, but did it anyway. A minute later, the man showed up at the door. He tried to walk in, pressing on the door. When he realized it was locked, he made eye contact with me through the glass and banged on the door. His eyes were bloodshot and his face was pale, but he still had that half-dead look. Through our eye contact and the door being locked, I think he knew that I was onto him, or whatever the hell it was that was going on. He didn't stay more than 10 seconds before running to his car. When the cops made it, only 3 cars were in the parking lot. Mine, the woman's, and the other man's. The creepy guy made it out. Unfortunately, this night didn't end on the typical he got away before anything happened. The officers followed some faint tracks in the snow into the woods behind the cafe and found the body of the other guy. None of his things were missing though. It looked like it was just an act of violence. And just as disturbing, his car wouldn't start either. They found that it had the exact same issue that my car had, which was the ignition line being deliberately cut. So with all that info found out, the story pretty much told itself. When both men pulled in that night, at some point the creepy guy cut the line to prevent him from leaving. Then he just waited for him to head back outside, where he then followed him out, and of course, with the car not turning on and there being no escape, he was either dragged into the woods or had tried running away. Regardless, it all ended the same. And with the heavy winds from the blizzard, me and the woman inside had no clue any of it was going on, just 20 feet outside the front doors. But at some point during the 30 minutes before I noticed anything, The man had also cut the line on my car, which likely means he had the same plans for me that night. I was able to make it safely to my sister's place, but aside from a few phone calls to check in on me, I never heard anything about the man being found. Don't think I'll be going on any road trips around winter again, though. And thinking about the image of that man walking out of the woods through the blizzard toward me, now knowing what he truly intended, still gets my heart racing. I was on a road trip from northern Washington to southern Utah to meet up with my family for just a few days around Christmas. For the road trip, I rented an Airbnb along the way. Wasn't looking for anything great, really just needed a place to sleep. So I found the cheapest place right in the halfway point in Idaho. It was kind of in the middle of nowhere, not near any towns or cities, but it was only a mile off the highway, so it was perfectly convenient for what I needed it for. I left in the morning and started getting close as the sun was going down. The section of Idaho I was in was covered in forest and seemed pretty uninhabited. Not a lot of houses or other places around, except for I guess the Airbnb. After a while of going down the highway, my phone told me to turn off on a very small dirt road. There were no lights or other indications that a path was even there. I drove slowly and carefully for the entire mile down this dirt road until I made it to the cabin. And on first glance, it looked way bigger than I expected. There were no images of the outside on the listing, but it said it was only a single bedroom cabin, so I expected something fairly small. I parked right outside the front. The whole forest around the cabin was dense and dark. I could hear all the birds and animals calling out as the night was coming in. I headed up to the door and legitimately almost had a heart attack when the door suddenly opened. "Didn't mean to scare ya," the man said in an overly friendly voice and with a wide smile. I was still recovering from the scare and confused who this guy was and why he was even here. He explained he was Charlie, the owner of the Airbnb. I think he could still tell I didn't understand, and that's when he said, "Your room is right over here." And I realized what this was. The Airbnb was a room in the cabin, not the whole cabin itself. I couldn't believe I'd made a mistake like that. I was sure it didn't say it was a shared living space. But at the time, and under pressure, I figured with the pictures not having shown the outside and it saying it was one room, it all made sense. I followed Charlie in. He led me down the long hallway all the way to the farthest room on the end of the cabin. The hallway was noticeably dark, didn't have a single ceiling light or lamp or anything. Charlie gave me a key to the cabin and to my room, then gave another big smile and said enjoy, leaving me to settle in. I closed the door and tossed my bag on the bed. I really wasn't comfortable with being out in some isolated cabin in the middle of nowhere with a stranger. But it was an Airbnb. Surely it was fine. And the only reason I decided to follow through with it and stay is because I was just there for a single night. I was gonna chill in the room, get some sleep, and head out first thing in the morning. I tried to not overthink it. I unzipped my bag and started unpacking just the few things I needed for the night. A couple minutes in, Charlie knocked on the room door. It made me jump again because I never heard his footsteps coming down the hall. It was like he had just been standing there. I walked over and cracked it open. His wide, empty smile was beginning to come off as really creepy, and the overly friendly voice he was faking made it even worse. He asked how I liked the room. I just said it was great, trying to be kind and keep the conversation quick. He nodded and told me to holler if I needed anything else. I said thank you and closed the door, but this time I waited for a second. The guy didn't move for an eerily long amount of time before I finally heard his footsteps depart and walk down the hall. I locked the door. Something about that guy really made me uncomfortable. I knew he could have just been trying really hard to be nice and a good host, but it came off as fake and almost uncanny. I stayed in the bedroom for 30 minutes, staying on my phone and just listening to the cabin to make sure Charlie wasn't doing anything weird. I could hear the muffled sound of the TV in the living room start playing after a while, and so eventually I felt good enough to start getting ready for bed. I set my phone on the nightstand to charge, brushed my teeth, then got in the shower. It was one of those old tub showers that looked honestly disgusting. The shower curtain looked fairly new though, and was one of those blurry, kind of see-through ones. I turned the water on and tried to be quick, but only a minute or so after getting the water running, I heard a slight thump from outside the bedroom, like somewhere in the hallway. I moved my body out of the water and tried to listen. I didn't hear anything else, but for a split second I thought I saw something, like possibly a shadow, move in the bedroom. I saw it through the blurry curtain, and immediately opened it and looked out, but didn't see anything. I stood there looking and waiting for a minute, then quickly finished washing off and got out and got dressed. When I walked back into the room, I naturally looked toward the door where I heard the sound from, and felt the blood rush from my face as I saw the bedroom door was cracked open. Not fully wide open, but obviously it didn't matter, because I knew I had locked it. I stood there frozen for a second, then rushed over, slamming it closed and locking it again. Something was seriously wrong with this cabin, and I no longer felt safe at all, not with Charlie opening locked doors like that. Even just thinking about that stranger walking in with his creepy smile while I was showering gave me chills. I picked up my phone from the nightstand, and while I tried to figure out what to do, I opened the Airbnb app and looked at the listing. I was trying to see if others had reported strange behavior in their reviews. There were only 3 other reviews, giving 5 stars, but honestly, rereading them now, they looked completely fake. And even more unsettling, I realized I hadn't made a mistake at all. The listing said it was a standalone cabin, not some room in a shared residence. Nothing was adding up, or I guess everything was adding up, but in the most unsettling way. I needed to leave immediately. I packed the few things I had into my bag, then went up to the door and put my ear against it, listening to try and hear where Charlie was, and if I could make a quick exit without drawing attention. I heard the muffled TV still playing from the living room, which I knew was right next to the front door. But as I stood there quietly, I started to hear something else. Something soft, coming from inside the room I was in. I slowly turned around. I heard this low, raspy breathing from right where the bedroom closet was. I threw the bedroom door open and sprinted out of there. The living room was empty as I ran past it and right out to my car. I drove dangerously fast down the rugged dirt road until I made it to the highway, and after calling my mom in a panic, she convinced me to make a report with the police. I did, but I'll save you all the unimportant details, because let's just say nothing came from it. His disturbing, creepy behavior wasn't provable, and the only thing he actually got in trouble for was listing the cabin incorrectly on Airbnb. And just to add to the creepiness, Charlie wasn't even his name. Thankfully, the listing was removed for false advertising, and I never saw it get relisted, so hopefully no one else has to go through that like I did. Can't even imagine what would have happened if I didn't leave the cabin that night. This was around Christmas time last year, I think between Christmas and New Year's. I was back in my hometown for winter break from college, but I still had bills and stuff, so when I wasn't busy with family, I did some door dashing. It was snowing this night, but not enough to pack the roads to the point it was dangerous to drive. But it was enough for most people to not want to leave their houses to get food, so nights like these were great for making decent money. Orders were going fine up until 10. Things slowed down, but I was still getting consistent orders. This one was just like any other, except maybe slightly further than usual, 20 minutes away. My hometown was small but spread out, so lots of places were scattered on the outskirts in the woods. However, when I pulled up to where I was supposed to deliver this order, I was a bit unsure about it. The directions had led me off the main road and onto a smaller forest road, eventually to a spot where it looked like there was supposed to be a gravel driveway, going deep into the trees. But it was completely snowed in. Nobody had plowed or shoveled it, and I couldn't even see any lights, like porch or outdoor lights, in the forest. I stayed in my car and called the customer, thinking there might have been something wrong with the address. He answered right away. The man sounded like he was mid-30s and a heavy smoker, with that deep, raspy voice. I said I was at the spot on the map he had marked to drop the order off at, but that I didn't see an open driveway, or house, or anything. The guy said it was probably covered in snow. The way he said it was like it should have been obvious. I responded, saying I think I see where the driveway is supposed to be, but that I wasn't comfortable driving my car through it. He then gave some snarky answer about this was why he ordered delivery, and if I wasn't going to deliver it, then what the hell was the point? I didn't totally agree with that, and it seemed like a really douchey response. But in the moment, I guess I just folded and said okay. I didn't want him to cancel the order or give me a negative review, especially not after I'd already driven all the way out here. Looking back, I've checked all the rules and stuff, and now I know that if I don't have access to the driveway or delivery location, then that's on the customer. At the time, I wasn't sure. So after he hung up, I got out with the order, locked my car, and started walking through the snow. It wasn't super deep, but with it being on a less maintained forest driveway, I think my car would have had a lot of trouble and probably gotten stuck. And it was really hard to tell where the actual path was. I mostly just tried to follow what I thought was a clearing in the trees, but with no lights around to guide me, I didn't really know where I was walking. I kept looking back behind me at my car, seeing it get further and further away. It was my only sense of distance I had because up ahead it was really dark, and I couldn't tell where I was going. It all just looked like the same forest. And all of a sudden, there was a sound to my left. A crunch that sounded eerily similar to a boot stepping in the snow. But it was far, like just barely in reach of my hearing. I looked out there, and even tried turning my phone light on, but it did absolutely nothing. I didn't see anything, and didn't hear anything else, so I kept walking. The cold started getting to me, and the endless darkness ahead had me rethinking everything. I figured by this point I would have seen the house, or something at least to tell me I was going the right way. I stopped in place and stood there for a second, just having a moment of realization that this was all really odd. I looked around, and I know it sounds stupid, but it took until then for me to think that there might actually not be a house here. Like this was all just some sort of weird trick to get me out here, which was absolutely terrifying to think about, standing there alone in the snowy, dark forest. I took my phone out and decided if the customer didn't answer or tried again to convince me to keep walking, then I'd leave and cancel the order. I pressed call and held the phone up to my ear as I listened to it ring. It rang twice before I saw something in the corner of my eye. I turned my head, seeing a light far out in the trees. Then it suddenly shut off, and a half second later, the call dropped. I didn't even bother waiting or trying to think anything through. I immediately started sprinting back the way I came. The crunching snow beneath me covered whatever sounds could have been coming from behind me, like if the guy was chasing me or not. Probably made it even more terrifying, not knowing what was behind me. I ran all the way to my car, and before I even made it up to the door, I saw something was wrong. It was leaning on one side, which led my eyes to one of the tires being flattened. He had slashed it. I got in and started it anyway, driving out of there. I called the police on my way out, but aside from some questioning, they were kind of useless and really didn't seem to take the whole thing that seriously. To me, I think it's pretty clear that the guy was leading me out into the woods for a reason, and even went as far as to slash the tires on my car to either keep me there or keep me from leaving. I don't know what I would have found had I kept walking into those woods, or what would have happened. I work for the city as a type of general contractor for regular work that needs to be done around town. A lot of the kind of stuff I do is seasonal work, and this happened during winter, so a good portion of my shifts were driving the snowplow to clear all the roads. Even on the days it didn't snow, I'd be salting the roads or plowing the leftover snow that we didn't get to the days before. I always volunteered to switch over my shifts to night shifts around this time of year because it was way calmer and peaceful to plow the roads when it was dark and empty. This night, I clocked in at the warehouse at 10 p.m. There was a massive snowstorm coming through the town that had started a few hours ago. I quickly checked which sections of town I was assigned, then got the keys and hopped in the plow truck. Even the roads that I could tell had already been plowed were starting to get bad again, and the heavy snowfall made it really hard to see. Luckily, no one else seemed to be out on the roads. I made my way about 20 minutes down to the southeast part of town that I was assigned to plow. I had been doing this for years, so I knew all the sections like the back of my hand. This area was the older part of town, the neighborhoods that had been there for who knows how long. Some of the houses had been rebuilt or heavily renovated because so many people nowadays move there just for the land the houses sit on. It was much more quiet and spread out there. Only downside, at least for my job, was that the roads were thin. I'd call them 1.5-lane roads, wider than a single-lane one-way road, but not wide enough for two cars to pass by each other without slowing down first. So obviously bringing the snowplow through there can be a bit difficult. At night, I usually didn't have to worry too much about it though. Anyway, when I got to the neighborhood, I began circling in and out of the streets, pushing the snow off the road. A big, spread out neighborhood like this takes a while. I was probably in the front of the neighborhood for almost 2 hours. I think I remember seeing it was close to 1 a.m. when I finished up and started making my way further in toward the back of the neighborhood. And that's when I pulled up behind a car. Nearly had to slam on the brakes, because in the storm I couldn't see them until they were just 30 feet ahead of me. It was some old beat-up dark red car, stopped right in the middle of the road. No way to get around this guy, even with a normal car. I waited a while, and the car didn't flash its hazards or move at all, so I thought he might have been stuck. I put the plow in park and hopped out, walking through the deep snow-covered street and up to the car. Just as I got a few feet away, the driver's side door swung open, and a man stepped out. As I started asking if he was stuck and needed help getting out, I noticed he looked really disturbing, not like anyone I'd seen before. He was very thin, his hair was disheveled, and his face looked exhausted, yet his eyes stayed wide open, like he hadn't slept in days but was hopped up on caffeine. I switched my question over to, "Are you okay?" This guy did not look well at all. I took a couple steps closer to try and help, but he mumbled something under his breath. Couldn't hear it through the harsh winds. I said what, and he mumbled again. The man just said, "Leave." I said I was just trying to make sure he was okay, and this time he nearly yelled, "Leave." So I backed up, and by the time I'd gotten back into my plow truck, he had driven off. I didn't know what the hell was wrong with that guy, but I knew there was something wrong. I stayed parked there for a minute, debating on calling the cops just because of how strange it all was. But I didn't get his tag, so I thought it wouldn't be useful anyway. Besides, he was probably just having a really bad night or something. I continued plowing the streets. Went another 30 minutes not seeing anyone at all. Even the snow that was on the streets didn't have very many tire tracks going through them. It looked like everyone had stayed in tonight to weather out the snowstorm. I was back to just going through the motions at this point, plowing the calm roads and wondering when the snow would stop falling, when I had to hit my brakes again. It was that same car, the old red one, stopped right in the middle of the street. This was a different spot from before though. I looked around, and there was only one house on this part of the road. After 30 seconds of waiting, I tapped on the horn, but got nothing in return. He stayed parked right there in the road. This time, I decided it was too strange and got on the line with the police to report this really unusual behavior. The license plate was covered in snow, or maybe just by the blizzard, I couldn't tell, so I got out to get a closer look. Pretty much just when I did, I saw through his windows that the car was empty. No one was in there. I kept the operator updated that I didn't know where the guy was, but then I heard something. A scream, faintly cutting through the wind. It came from the house right off the road. I took a few steps closer, unsure if I'd heard it correctly, and that's when I heard it again, and saw that the front door was wide open. I sort of put the pieces together of the man being gone and the house being open, and knew something horrible was going on. I called out as I started running through the deep snow to get up to the front door. I told the operator everything that was going on, and of course they told me to wait in the truck for an officer to get there. I didn't listen. I went up to the front door, and the inside of the house was dark, aside from a hallway light glowing from upstairs, and I could hear the horrifying screams of a woman calling for help, muffled by the sounds of someone slamming their body into the bedroom door. I hurried up the staircase and found the disturbing-looking guy trying to break down the door, slamming his shoulder into it, kicking it, and doing everything he could to get it open. He didn't even turn to look at me, or stop when I approached him. Wasn't until I pulled him away that he started fighting back. I was able to get control of him, enough to keep him away from the door. The guy was completely losing it. and I hadn't noticed until I managed to pin him to the ground that there was a knife on the floor at the other end of the hallway. I think in the struggle, he had tried to grab it from his pocket at some point and lost control of it before he could do anything. I knew the moment I saw it that I had gotten really lucky. Few minutes later, he ran out of energy and couldn't fight much more, and when police arrived, they cuffed him and brought him in. Now, I think most of what happened is pretty easy to put together, but I still feel like I didn't get a lot of specifics from the officers in the weeks afterward. All I know is the house he broke into was his ex-wife's house, where I guess he also used to live. Probably lost it in the divorce and lost his mind as well. That's all the details I managed to get. I still feel slightly guilty for not calling the police the first time I saw him, because I did have a bad feeling about him. I just didn't think it could have possibly been that bad. Thankfully, everyone managed to be okay afterward, though. I worked at a local gas station, usually night shifts. I'd been there for over 6 years. Of all the craziness and strange characters and things I'd seen throughout my time working there, nothing even compares to what happened a few months ago. Just for a reference of the place I worked at, it's a gas station that I'd describe as being on the outskirts of the city. Not necessarily remote, but past the gas station, there was nothing for a good 20 miles. It was the place people stopped at to fill up right when entering or just before leaving town. This was in the beginning of winter, and this night it was snowing a decent amount. Enough to keep most folks home, but truckers and whatnot would still be coming through. Nothing about this night was out of the usual for the first couple of hours. I stayed behind the counter, saving all the other work for later, when I knew it'd be dead. Around 1 a.m., I got a call on the store phone. We almost never get calls, especially overnight. The only calls I'd sometimes get were from my manager to let me know something he forgot to tell me just a few minutes after he left. I saw this was from an unknown number. I picked it up and asked if I could help them. While I was talking, and for a few seconds afterward, I heard a man talking in the background, and the audio kept cutting out too, like when wind is hitting the microphone. "Hello, anyone there?" This time, no one spoke. I knew it wasn't dead though, because I could still hear the mic crackling. After a few more seconds, I hung up. It didn't feel like a prank call, but it also didn't feel like an accidental dial. Someone was on the other end, just listening. I didn't think too hard about it. 10 minutes later, I'd pretty much forgotten it happened. Starting to feel bored, and seeing the snow was starting to stack up, I threw my coat on and rolled the maintenance cart out to the gas pumps to do all the cleaning and everything before it got too bad out. It was cold and icy out, and the wind only seemed to be picking up. As I was moving between each of the pumps, I felt really uneasy. Something about how quiet and dark it was out there had me feeling off. Kinda like every time I was doing something, it felt like something was behind me. Usually being out there at night didn't bother me, so the fact I was feeling strange this night was really odd. I remember being aware of how uneasy I was, and thinking in the moment how in all 6 years I'd worked there, this was the one time I'd felt this way, without any reason. Which then made me think there had to be a reason. I looked around. The roads were empty, and even the town, as far as I could see, looked asleep and quiet. I finished doing what I was doing and hurried up and got back inside, warming up and scratching my head at what just happened out there. As soon as I was inside, though, the feeling went away. I thought maybe I was just tired, so I grabbed an iced coffee from the fridge and sipped on it to wake myself up. It was weirdly dead for the next hour. I think it was 2 a.m., so of course it was always dead around this time, but not seeing a single car or truck come through was weird. I started the rest of the work stuff that I had to get done, mostly stocking and reorganizing a bunch of shelves to prep for a delivery in the morning. While stocking, the phone started ringing again. I took a second, then started walking over to the counter, but just before I picked up, the call dropped. I stood there and looked at the phone for a minute, really confused. My mind instantly thought back to the first phone call from an hour ago. I tried to shake it off again and get back to work, walking back to the aisle, but as I passed by the front doors, I saw someone outside. He was far back, walking through the snow toward the building. I couldn't tell which direction he came from, but he was definitely heading in here. 30 seconds later, he walked in. I looked up from the shelf and greeted him, but stuttered halfway through when I saw his face. He looked at me with dead eyes and a narrow frown. He did not look friendly at all. The guy was pretty big too, 6 foot something with broad shoulders, and just overall an intimidating appearance. I moved from the aisle back to the counter. The man didn't speak, but made his way through the shop, sort of snaking through the aisles very slowly. He was looking at the stuff on the shelves, but it was almost like he wasn't really looking for anything. And as I watched him, I got this weird feeling that he wasn't alone. I kept checking out the windows, looking at the dark, snowy parking lot, and almost waiting for someone else to appear. The longer this went on, the more uneasy I felt. Best way I can explain the feeling was like my body knew this was the calm before the storm. Everything felt even quieter, too. My whole body felt like it was preparing for something to happen. And then, suddenly, something shifted. The man was looking over the shelves at me, and this time, when I made eye contact, he didn't look away. He held his gaze. After a moment, I looked away, moving my eyes toward the window, and immediately noticed someone out there. I only caught a glimpse of them, moving right past the window and around to the side of the building. I looked back at the man inside. He was still staring at me, and although he didn't say anything, his eyes were telling me to not move or do anything. I was sure if I even tried to pick up the phone, or tried to run, this guy would pull out a weapon and stop me. Not a minute later, I heard a thump on the back door, followed by a few more, and then a heavy metal cracking sound. The other guy had broken into the back of the building. Now, even in the moment, I was really confused. He wasn't being sneaky by bashing down the door, so why didn't he just walk in through the front of the building? The man in front of me was still staring at me, while the other was rummaging through something in the back room for a while. Then he appeared in the doorway. He looked furious, glaring at me, and then glaring at the other guy. Oddly, he didn't enter the main shopping area though. He stayed right in the doorway. But as soon as the other guy saw him, he essentially charged toward me. I muttered whatever helpless words I could to try to de-escalate, but the guy grabbed me and basically dragged me into the back room. Both of these dudes were way bigger than I was, and probably armed, so I had no chance at fighting. When we got to the back room, everything was ransacked, but the men didn't stop there. They dragged me out the door. By this point, both of them were holding on to me and forcing me across the back of the building until we got to the edge of the parking lot. Beyond that point was a field of scattered trees, and really nothing else. I was still trying to plead with them, but it was like they couldn't even hear me. Whatever they were doing, they'd already made up their minds on. This was all planned. They forced me through the snow far away from the gas station. I mean, probably a quarter mile through the deep snow to where I couldn't even see the building anymore. We were just in the middle of the trees. Then suddenly they tossed me on the ground, my face planted in the snow, and I waited in horror. I was scared to turn around, thinking I'd be looking into the barrel of a gun. But after a few seconds, I heard them take a few footsteps and started walking away. I still didn't trust it. I waited a whole minute before looking behind me. They were gone. I stayed there for a few minutes, knowing I couldn't just run up behind them. But also, I was freezing. It was around 10 degrees outside, and I didn't have my coat on, or snow boots, or gloves. I think they really did leave me out there to die. Eventually, the cold was so numbingly painful that I had to run back. I followed the tracks from the men all the way back to the gas station, and with no signs of them outside, I quietly got close up to the building. I couldn't hear anything inside. I wrapped around to the front and saw through the windows that no one was in there, and finally ran in and called the police. Thinking on how planned everything felt by the two men, I was sure that even with a description of them, neither would be found. But the cops actually did find one of them, the one that came into the shop. The security cameras had a good enough view of his face to get an identity. However, the other guy never stepped foot in that area of the building. He stayed in the back, where there weren't any cameras. And this one guy that they did find didn't speak a word about his accomplice. In fact, he basically said nothing at all as to what they were doing. And even stranger is that nothing of value was really missing. The obvious stuff, like the cash in the register, was still there. With the entire back room ransacked, though, the guy was definitely looking for something. Something specific that he probably found and got away with. To put a bow on top of this whole thing, I asked my manager, who was the owner of the gas station, about why he thinks they broke in and what they were looking for. But he started acting really weird after that, straight up asking why I was even asking that, as if I didn't just go through a whole ordeal and almost lose my life because of it. And a few weeks later, I woke up to a call from him firing me. I was given severance pay and everything, so it was all technically legal, but extremely suspicious. After working there and knowing him for 6 years, suddenly cutting me off after a simple question was odd to say the least. Something else was going on there that I wasn't aware of, and I think he didn't like that I was trying to figure it out. Honestly though, I just feel lucky to be alive after that. This was 2016. Because of my work and where my family lived, and a bunch of scheduling things, this was one of the few times I spent Christmas alone. I had a nice, small house in a good neighborhood, and although being alone on the holiday wasn't great, I still enjoyed the day, either just staying in watching Christmas movies or going for walks around the neighborhood if the weather was decent. That year, Christmas Day started calm. I woke up to quiet snow falling outside, not a full storm yet. I made coffee, put Home Alone on in the background, and ate breakfast on the couch. It was honestly kind of nice. Around noon, the snow started picking up a little, but nowhere near blizzard levels. I decided to go for a quick walk anyway, before it was too late. The neighborhood had the whole holiday feeling to it, with lights on the houses, wreaths on the door, and no cars on the road. Just a calm, empty, quiet neighborhood. I only saw one other person on the whole walk, a guy shoveling his driveway 2 streets over. Other than that, it was quiet. When I got home, though, the wind was starting to build, blowing snow in little spirals across the street. I figured the forecast had been right about the storm coming in the evening, but I didn't mind. I had food, blankets, and movies, so I was all set to stay in. The storm hit faster than expected. Around 5, it went from snowy to whiteout in under 30 minutes. The wind started shaking the windows. Not enough for me to worry, but enough to remind me that I probably shouldn't go outside again. And with all that noise outside, the house almost felt extra quiet. I made dinner and kept watching movies. By 8, though, the storm had gotten bad enough it was drowning out the TV. I could hear things thumping around outside, branches or maybe loose Christmas decorations. At the time, I didn't think too much of it. It was about an hour later, so around 9, when I heard the first knock. Not loud or frantic, just a single knock on the front door, sharp enough to cut through the wind and definitely be a knock, not a thump like I'd been hearing. I froze on the couch. No one ever came to my door on Christmas, and no one should have been out in that weather anyway. I muted the TV and waited, listening. For a long moment, there was nothing but the storm. Then another knock, 3 this time. I got up and walked toward the door, but not close enough for anyone outside to be able to see me through the side window. I didn't say anything, didn't move the blinds either. I just listened. My door didn't have one of those holes you could look through. It just had the side windows, which of course if I looked through, then whoever was out there would also see me. I stood there until my nerves started catching up with me. I really couldn't hear much of anything over the storm, but whoever it was didn't knock again, and I figured I should probably just leave it. There was no way I was going to answer the door anyway. Eventually, I went back to the couch, still tense but trying to brush it off. I turned the movie back on, but it only took about 5 minutes for me to hear something else. I quickly paused the TV and listened. It was very faint, but sounded like something being dragged through the snow, slowly moving from the front door all the way around the house. I followed the sound with my eyes until it went up to the back door and stopped. There was no curtain or anything covering that door, so I was hesitant to even peer around the corner and look. But then there were those 3 knocks again. I almost couldn't believe it. I stood up and tried to slowly lean around the corner and look at the back door. Instantly, I saw a pair of eyes piercing in at me. It was so dark though, I could only barely see the man before I moved back out of sight. What the hell was he doing here? I felt this was enough to call 911, even if nothing else happened, because of how creepy this was. I got my phone and got on the line with an operator. I still stayed in the living room though, honestly just too scared to move and be seen by the man again. Something about the look in his eyes was horrifying. I think I was standing there on the phone for 2 to 3 minutes, when suddenly there was a slight scraping sound. And before I could even think of what it was, there was a sudden loud crash against the back door. I heard the glass shatter and parts of the door slamming and falling onto the floor. The wind instantly flooded the house and covered up any other sounds I could have heard. I assumed the man got inside the house, but I couldn't hear any footsteps or anything, and there was no way I was going to look over there. I quickly hid behind the couch. Not the best hiding spot, but I didn't know what else to do. The fact that I couldn't see anything and couldn't hear anything other than the heavy winds, made the next 5 minutes excruciatingly anxious and tense. I knew the man had to be walking around looking for me, or maybe stealing stuff from my house, but I didn't dare try looking. And then, finally, I heard knocks at the front door and a police officer's voice call out through the wind. I got up and sprinted to the door, letting the officer in. But the man was already gone. There were wet shoe prints going throughout parts of the house. I don't know if he was looking for me or what, but it seemed like after breaking in and barely searching, he just left. His shoe prints in the snow went toward the field in the backyard and were covered up by the blizzard within minutes. Even after the police left, I didn't sleep. I just sat on the edge of my bed with every light in the house on, listening to the wind rattle what was left of the back door. At some point, the storm let up, but the silence that followed felt even worse. Every creak in the house made me flinch. The officers returned when the sun came up to take another look. They told me they'd patrol the area for a while, but with the storm burying everything, there wasn't much else they could do. Before they left, one of them said something I still think about sometimes. He told me that with storms like that, it wasn't uncommon for people to wander, looking for unlocked houses, knowing the blizzard would cover their traces. But I mentioned the knocking and how he circled my home. The officer just shook his head. He said that some people test the doors first to see who answers, or if anyone does. So by not answering the first time, and then showing myself to him at the back door, if he was trying to find out whether I was alone, I basically gave him the answer. I never really realized how every small choice I made that night sort of led to what ended up happening. I just got insanely lucky that the man wasn't more determined to find me, because I can only imagine how things would have ended if he did. This was in 2013. I lived alone with my dog Amber in a forested neighborhood with small, quiet homes. Amber was a large husky with amber eyes, hence the name. And being a husky, we went for a lot of walks in the winter. This night, after getting home from work at 9, I immediately got her leash and took her out for a walk on the trail behind the house. It was a trail that went behind the neighborhood, through the woods, and connected a bunch of parks together. It was kind of like a forest preserve trail. There was a good amount of snow on the ground, but Amber loved it, so I toughed it out. It was nice and quiet outside that night, the sort of quiet you only get in the winter because no one else was out. We got a half-mile in, so maybe 10 minutes into the walk, when Amber suddenly stopped, perked her head up for a second, then turned around. At first, I thought she was looking at me, but then I saw her eyes were actually looking past me. I turned and looked over my shoulder. There was nothing behind me. The trail was empty, and the woods were silent and pitch black in every direction. I tried to ask Amber if she was okay, and even walked past her and pulled on the leash a bit. She kept her eyes locked on the path behind us, but eventually, with enough convincing, she started walking again. I kept checking over my shoulders and never saw a thing, so I figured it was just one of those times a dog hears or sees something and fixates on it, even though it's nothing. She was a smart dog, don't get me wrong, but she always had her strange moments. We finished the trail and headed back on the neighborhood street. The rest of that walk, she wasn't as energetic, so whatever she thought she saw or heard, she really didn't like. Once inside, though, she was back to normal. I fed her and started making dinner for myself. I just threw some leftovers in the microwave. Only 10-ish minutes after getting back from the walk, though, Amber all of a sudden started howling, which she usually does when she's scared. She was in the living room, so I ran in there and found her howling at the window. I hushed her and walked up to the window. The blinds weren't down, so I could see outside, and didn't see anything. But after a bit, I noticed that most of the window was frosted over, except for the one spot I was looking through. It looked like the frost had melted off that part, as if someone was breathing close to the glass, looking inside. Once I realized that, I quickly pulled the blinds down. I calmed down Amber and stood there in the living room trying to make sense of it. I had no way to know for sure, but with her barking and not really knowing any other way the frost would have melted like that, it seemed pretty likely someone had been there. I went around the house and checked the other windows, but didn't see any other signs of anyone creeping around. I was pretty weirded out, though having Amber on watch for me helped keep me much calmer and less scared about it, for better or for worse. If I were alone, I'd probably have thought about calling the cops, but it really didn't even cross my mind. I ate my dinner and turned on a movie to wind down for the night. I can't remember if I'd finished the movie and had started something else, or if it was toward the end of it, but I know at least an hour, maybe two, had gone by. Amber was sleeping with her head resting on my lap, so when she suddenly lifted her head, I looked down and saw her eyes open and looking to my right. I only had a second to turn and see that she was looking at the front door before there were sudden loud knocks against it. Both me and Amber jumped up from the couch, but I quieted her down so I could listen. Whoever was outside must have heard me though, because as soon as Amber stopped barking, he called out, "Anyone home? Could you answer the door and help me out for a moment?" I didn't recognize his voice at all, and in the few seconds I took thinking of how to respond, he called out again. "I heard you in there. I know you're listening. I just need some help with directions. I'm not from here, and it's real cold out here." The way he just tried to explain his whole situation through the door without me having answered yet was really creepy to me, and something in his voice didn't sound genuine. So I stayed quiet, hoping he'd realize I was just going to ignore him and would just leave. There was a longer pause this time, maybe 20 seconds, before he slammed his fist against the door. "You're a real piece of shit. I'm sure this'll come back around." His voice was eerily monotone when he said that, and I wasn't sure what to make of that last line. It sounded like a slight threat. I heard his footsteps leave the porch and walk away. After I thought he was far enough, I hurried to the window and looked out, but I couldn't see him. I contemplated calling the cops for 30 minutes. It was one of those situations where I felt it was justified to call, but also there wasn't anything anyone could do now that the man was gone. So I ended up deciding on a middle ground of putting in a report through a call on the non-emergency line. That way they could have the incident on file if anything were to happen. After getting off the phone, I was wide awake and knew I wouldn't be able to sleep for a while. So I sat back down and continued to watch TV, volume lowered so I could listen if he came back. And sure enough, 40 minutes later, I noticed a light moving through the blinds, followed by the sound of a car coming down the road outside. And once the sound got louder and the light got closer, it suddenly shut off. I listened to the car continue slowly rolling up and stop right outside my house. I stayed on the couch and waited for a minute, listening and praying that this was someone else, and that at any point they were going to leave. But after a while passed, I got up and bent one of the blinds down, just slightly enough to look outside. There was an old, either black or gray car parked right on the curb, headlights off, and no movement in or around it. I must have stared at the car for an entire minute, waiting to see someone get out or something, when I heard a dull click sound on the other end of the house, and half a second later, everything shut off around me. The whole house went dark. Someone had cut the power. I didn't hesitate this time to get on the phone with the cops. Within 15 seconds, the person outside started banging on the door, hitting it non-stop angrily. Some of the hits sounded heavier, even shaking the house. I was sure this was the same guy from before. I told the operator what I could, and looked back out the window to describe the car that was parked outside. As I did, the knocking stopped and footsteps rushed toward the window. I pulled back and let the blinds close. He stood outside the window for a bit, like he was waiting for me to look out again. I continued whispering to the operator on the phone. Meanwhile, Amber had been barking and whimpering the entire time. And I realized after a minute that I hadn't heard anything else. It was just Amber barking. I waited 3 or 4 minutes until the operator told me an officer was 30 seconds away before looking out the window again. Footprints led away from the window, through the snow into where the car was parked before. It was gone now. Having an officer there was a huge relief, and he looked around and noted everything that happened, but that really was it. There was nothing else to do. For weeks, even months after that night, there was this lingering feeling that the man was still out there, having some sort of vendetta against me. I just keep thinking on everything that happened that night, all the way back to Amber seeing or hearing something on the path behind us. I genuinely feel like that man had been stalking me the entire night. Knowing how likely unstable and creepy this guy was, I don't think it's far off to assume that if I'd opened the door, or not had Amber with me on that walk, and was entirely alone, I could have gone missing and never been seen again. I'm 28, and this was 2 years ago. It was just a few days before Christmas, but I had taken the entire week off of work, or in-person work. At my job, we could essentially schedule when we'd actually come into the office, and I'd managed to have enough remote days racked up to be able to work from home this whole week. I knew there was supposed to be a big winter storm hitting the town around this week, and with the holiday and everything, I just wanted to stay home and have some more chill work days. Our company navigated remote work by basically just saying we had to get our work done by its deadline, and aside from that, it was up to us how we wanted to go about it. There were a few more rules and stuff, but this meant I could really work whatever schedule I wanted. I always preferred sleeping in and working late into the night. This day, I started work around noon. The first several hours were slow and calm, I guess. I sipped on my coffee and tried to get some work done. Over the course of those hours, the wind got increasingly heavier, slamming into the window next to me, and snow slowly began coming down. By 3 or 4, it was already dark outside, from the clouds overhead and all the snow flooding on top of the neighborhood. I was gonna go out to grab dinner, but with the roads being the way they were, I decided to stay in for the rest of the night. I worked at my desk for another couple hours. The sun had set and the winter storm had come in at full force. I left the window shades open so I could watch the snow fall from my desk, but out of nowhere, a light flickered outside. I looked over and saw a thin beam of light moving around. It was for sure a flashlight. I leaned back from my desk and looked at the window for maybe 10 seconds, watching the flashlight move around outside the window, before getting curious enough to get up and walk over to the window to see what was going on. I mean, it had to be freezing cold. Why was anyone out there? I peered outside the window, trying to look down the side of my house. I spotted the light, but before I could trace it back to whoever was shining it, it turned off. Or maybe went behind something. I couldn't tell. It was too dark, and the snow blocked pretty much my whole view. With nothing else to see, I sat back down. Honestly, I think I assumed some neighbor might have lost a pet out in the storm, or was just looking for something in general. I didn't worry much about it, and tried to focus back on my work while the storm continued outside. Over the next 2-ish hours, the house constantly creaked and settled, but several times I thought I'd heard something slightly louder and more distinct, enough so for me to stop and look away from my desk, hoping to hear it again and figure out what it was. I didn't, but how could it not be the house just making noises? The thought that it was anything else seemed really far-fetched. That was until there was a much louder thud sound. It sounded more like something breaking than just a hit against the wall, let alone the house settling in the wind. And it sounded like it was inside the house. I got up from my desk and walked into the hallway, hearing nothing, and then moving downstairs. Everything looked and sounded normal, not that I could hear too much over the heavy winds, but there weren't any more loud thuds. Honestly, I wasn't scared enough to do a full-on search through every section of the house, not without any other noises or anything. So I started to head back up to my office, making it nearly to the top of the steps, when suddenly there was a click sound and the whole house went dark. The power cut out. I froze in place for a second. The entire house was pitch black. With the snowstorm outside, no light was even coming in through the windows. I couldn't even see my own hands in front of my face. I thought the storm had to have messed with the power, or maybe tripped the breaker. I began slowly moving back down the stairs, feeling for every step as I carefully and blindly made my way down to the lower hallway. The basement door, which led to the breaker box, was at the far end of this hallway, so I started following the wall, tracing my hand against it to keep myself going the right way, when I started to hear something. I stopped walking. It was something moving, sort of muffled, and from behind the basement door. It got closer and closer, until suddenly there was the quiet creak of the basement door opening. I could feel my eyes get wider as I stared down the darkness-filled hallway. I took one step back and quietly slipped through the open bathroom door that was right next to me. I still couldn't see, and I felt like closing the door would give me away, so I left it open. Slow, quiet footsteps began walking down the hallway. I was holding my breath, trying not to make a sound. The footsteps came closer and closer, until I felt they were just outside the bathroom I was in. Then the footsteps passed right by the open doorway. I never even saw them, walking just 2 or 3 feet from me. That's how incredibly dark it was. The footsteps continued to slowly move through the hallway until they reached the stairs, and from then on, it was carpet, so I couldn't hear anything at all. Suddenly, the sound of the snowstorm outside took over my hearing again, almost feeling amplified by the emptiness inside the home. The person could have stopped walking and still been standing right at the bottom of the stairs, but I took the chance that they most likely continued upstairs, and I decided to make a run for it. I left the bathroom and blindly moved to the other side of the home, sticking my hands out to try not to slam into a wall. I made it to the garage door, grabbed my keys, and left out the side door to get into my car in the driveway. I drove away and used the SOS device in my car to get in contact with the police. No surprise, the person was gone when they got there. From what the cops could find, after breaking in and turning off the power, whoever it was had essentially went straight upstairs and into the office, then to the bedroom, and nowhere else. Which meant this person was definitely there looking for me. What's really unsettling is the person most likely knew me and knew the layout of my house enough to walk perfectly straight through it in the dark and to go straight upstairs to my office where they knew I'd be. Could have even been someone I talked to regularly that I had no idea had horrible intentions. It made me question everything. I moved away, having paranoia about essentially every coworker or friend that I wasn't super close with. Since moving, I haven't had anything happen. Hopefully, I don't ever have any updates to give, but if something else happens, I'll let you know. This was a couple of years ago. I was 23. I rented this cabin because I wanted a stress-free vacation. It was early winter, I think 2 weeks after Christmas, which I guess is off-season for these kinds of cabins, so I got a really good deal on it. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was how completely silent it was. If you haven't been to an isolated cabin or spot in the woods in a while, the lack of any sounds is really strange at first. Calm, but also a bit unnerving, acting as a reminder to know just how alone you are out there. Anyway, the cabin itself was exactly like the pictures. Simple and a little old, but overall cozy. I unpacked slowly, made a quick dinner, and spent the night reading by the fireplace. Nothing happened that night. I just went to sleep and woke up feeling great in the morning. I made breakfast and coffee and stayed in for the whole morning and a bit of the afternoon, before getting a little bored. I noticed when I got there that the owner had a rough map hung up next to the front door of a trail behind the cabin, so I decided this was a good time to check it out. Looked like it was just a couple of miles, and from the owner's description was just a simple walking path. I got my jacket and headed out. It was pretty clear right away that this wasn't some nice, well-maintained trail. I think the owner might have made it a few years ago and never touched it again. It was mostly overgrown and very hard to keep track of. And oddly, on the map in the cabin, it only showed a single trail, basically just a loop through the woods. But halfway down, I came across another path splitting from it. I didn't see anything down that way in the distance, but curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check it. I had nothing better to do anyway. For the first 5-ish minutes, I didn't see anything. Had no idea what the trail could have possibly been there for, or how it was even made. But then I came across a section of the path covered in thick brush. And after pushing my way through it, I found what was at the end. There was another cabin. It was old and rotting, moss on the sides, and dilapidated to the point it was clear that it hadn't been taken care of in decades. It was just about the creepiest looking cabin I'd ever seen, and it being out in the middle of the woods, not all that far away from the one I was staying at, only made it more disturbing. I walked up closer to it and peered into the doorway, which was missing the actual door. It looked the same on the inside as it did on the outside, completely in ruins, and even smelling like rot and mildew. Dust covered every inch of the place, but the one odd thing I saw that stood out the most was a line of footprints on the floor. like scuffs on the wood and in the dust that hadn't faded yet, like someone had been there somewhat recently. My immediate thought was that maybe some person that rented the cabin before had also found this place. But as I was thinking about it, something shifted in the side of my view. When I looked, I saw a black, open doorway. Black as in whatever that room was. It didn't have any windows or lights at all. It looked like a void of darkness past the doorway. Even though it was in the corner of my eye, I was absolutely sure I saw something move right there. I sort of panicked and just ran back to the trail, moving quickly until I made it back to the rental cabin. I couldn't help but have this feeling, almost indescribable, that something really bad had happened in that cabin. Or was happening. I don't know. The gut feeling was strong though, and there was no way I was going back there. I locked myself in the cabin and tried to relax. I told myself that likely nothing would come from it. I texted the owner of the rental about the old cabin I found out there, hoping he would confirm it was just an abandoned place on his land and nothing to worry about. An hour later, he texted me back, and I thought his response was strange. He responded with just a single sentence, saying there were no other cabins nearby in the woods. I didn't know how to respond to that, because I just told him that I found a cabin back there. What did he mean there weren't any other cabins? It was like he didn't believe me, or didn't want me to know anything about the cabin I found, almost gaslighting me. I didn't end up saying anything else to him. Over the rest of the afternoon and later into the night, I was able to settle back down and almost forget about that other cabin. Think I eventually was able to convince myself it was just an abandoned, vacant, and forgotten place. No more, no less. I made dinner, had a few drinks, and sat by the fireplace. It was probably around 11 or so, because I know I was staying up pretty late. And really just out of nowhere, that feeling came back. My stomach tightened, and that aching, awful gut feeling grew inside me again. It was very sudden. I sat up from the couch and started looking around, but everything was dark and quiet. So I got up and looked out the window, thinking maybe I unconsciously heard something. The woods were dead quiet. No movement, no sounds. Even the trees were perfectly still and motionless. How calm it looked out there was unsettling. I felt paranoid, which isn't a feeling I was used to. Honestly, that might have been the first and only time in my life I'd ever felt that way. I stared out the window, looking at the dark entrance to the rugged trail behind the cabin. And then, after 5 minutes of waiting, I heard something. A few leaves crunch or sticks snapping right outside of the cabin. Someone was out there, walking around. I followed the sounds, moving toward the front door. I faintly heard the thumps of the person step onto the porch and go right up to the door, and then it went quiet. After 30 seconds, I quickly pulled my phone out, and for some reason, instead of calling the police, I texted the owner, telling him someone was outside the cabin right now, and asking if he knew who it was, or if someone was supposed to be here. I don't know why I didn't just play it safe and call the police first. I think it just felt weird to call the police to someone else's cabin. But eerily, as soon as I sent the text, I heard a phone chime right outside the front door of the cabin. My gut feeling instantly got even worse. It was the owner outside, but why the hell was he here? And why didn't he text me first? Why was he just standing out there? Something wasn't right about any of this, and I knew in the back of my head that this all somehow connected back to the abandoned cabin out there. Even after I heard his phone chime, he didn't text me back. I dialed 911. There were a couple minutes after I got off the phone with the police that I just stood still, waiting in the eerie silence, knowing he was still right outside that door. My biggest fear was knowing that he had to have had a key to the cabin and could just walk in if he wanted to. But for some reason, he didn't. It felt like he was out there, debating whether or not to do something. Eventually, I heard a few thumps on the porch, and then it remained quiet until police arrived. I told them everything, and also showed them the messages on my phone. They immediately went to the owner's main address to talk to him, and he wasn't there. Didn't answer the door and didn't answer his phone, which, if it was him outside the cabin, this all made sense, because there was no way he could have gotten far just walking through the woods. Over the next few days, when they finally got him to talk, he still denied everything. Said he wasn't even at the cabin, and didn't know anything I was talking about. The officers agreed this was all super fishy, and seemed like he was up to something. Or maybe that cabin I found had something he was hiding, but without a search warrant, and without any real evidence of anything, the cops really couldn't do anything else. So I'm not sure what was going on there. Maybe it was partially my fault for having explored further than I should have, but I think things could have been a lot worse if I had tried to dig a little deeper into what was in that cabin. This happened on New Year's. I was home alone for the holiday, having already spent Christmas with family, and didn't have anyone to go out with on New Year's night. So I just kicked it back at home, had a couple beers, and watched TV the whole night. I watched the whole Times Square celebration, then just turned on some older holiday movies. I wasn't all that tired, and around 2 a.m. I felt like getting up and doing something, since I'd been sitting on the couch pretty much all day. I checked out the windows. It was snowing a bit, but not too much, and I knew it was cold and dark out there, but a walk just sounded really nice. I grabbed my jacket and hat and gloves, and headed out to walk around the neighborhood. Right away, I noticed it was surprisingly quiet outside. Even though it was 2 a.m., I figured because of New Year's, there would be parties and whatever. Yet, all the houses only had their outdoor Christmas lights on, and no cars were driving through the streets. It was just calm and empty. Very peaceful, actually. I'm not even too sure how long I was out there for. Obviously, I wasn't fully sober, so time was hard to keep track of. And I was zigzagging through the neighborhood with no real direction or route in mind. Eventually, I made it to the park. It looked like the path hadn't been shoveled since that morning, but it only looked like maybe 2 inches of snow, so I just started walking down it anyway. Thought the slight change in scenery would keep the walk interesting. I walked a little ways in before realizing that not only was the snow actually getting harder to walk through, but there also weren't any lights on along the path. I'd walked it at night before, and it always had these small, sort of street lamps lining the trail, but I guess they turned them off for the winter. So after a few minutes, I turned back around. I dragged my feet through the snow, walking maybe a minute back the way I came, when I saw something pretty weird. There was another set of tracks, going right along mine from just a few minutes ago. Someone had to have been walking right behind me, and honestly, it kind of looked like they had been following me, given that there were no shoe prints there before. But I didn't see anyone, and when I tried to see if they had turned around, or where they went, I found the tracks led off the trail, going out into the dark areas that I couldn't see anything in. For all I knew, there could have been someone standing just 10 feet in front of me, and I wouldn't have a clue, because it was pitch black. I quickened my pace to get out of there, but I still didn't fully think it was something to worry too much about. I admit it could have been me being tipsy and not realizing the strangeness and possible danger I was in, especially with the tracks going off the trail and leading straight into the darkness. At the time, I tried to assume it was just some really big coincidence. I got away from there and walked further into my neighborhood, not going directly home yet. I walked for 15 more minutes. Not that I was looking very hard, but I didn't see anyone else, so I thought by then I was all good. When I made it back home, I took all my winter stuff off and figured I'd take a shower and then hopefully be tired enough to get in bed. It wasn't until I was already halfway up the stairs that I realized how dark it was, and that the upstairs lights were off. This caught me off guard because I'm the kind of person that leaves all the lights on all day. I hadn't even been upstairs since waking up in the morning, so I definitely left the lights on up there. I could see how this might sound like some small thing that I fixated on, but I think even if I were fully drunk, I'd still have known that those lights were left on. I cautiously walked the last few steps up to the hall and looked down, then flicked the light back on. I didn't really know what I was looking for though. I walked through and just peeked my head into each of the rooms, seeing if there was anything obvious. I made sure to close each of the doors after looking, which is why after checking the last room and turning back around, I felt my heart stop. The first door right by the stairs was wide open. To me, that 100% confirmed that someone was inside my house right now. After freezing up for a few seconds, I called out asking who was there. I was scared to move. They could have been right there in that room, or had snuck downstairs and really been anywhere at this point. I remember taking slow, careful, and quiet steps down the hall, feeling adrenaline and a sinking, awful feeling in my gut as I approached the doorway. And then I woke up. And no, this wasn't all a dream. I woke up laying on the floor in the middle of the hallway, head spinning and with a horrible migraine. I think only 10-ish minutes had passed between then and now, and it was apparent that I'd been attacked and knocked unconscious, with no recollection of anything but the moments leading up to whatever the hell happened. Even my vision was blurry and fading in and out. I called 911 right away. Whoever it was that broke in and attacked me was long gone, but I tried to give the police an account of everything I could remember. It still bothers me so much that a part of my memory was just blacked out like that. I likely came face to face with the guy, probably enough to get a good description of him. Hell, I might have even known exactly who it was. Yet, it's like my own head is hiding it from me. After that night, the updates were minimal, and nothing ever led to anything significant. I don't know who it was or what his intentions really were, but I wouldn't doubt it if he didn't even want me to wake up. It was about 4 years ago during the holidays. I had driven out all the way to a small town in Montana where my parents lived to surprise them for Christmas. I stayed there for a whole week before heading back home. The drive was about 16 hours, which I never thought was too bad. I really didn't mind pulling over at rest stops and taking a nap for a few hours if I had to, and I always thought it was more worth it rather than stopping at a hotel or motel. mostly because it would make the trip take even longer. Anyway, I left in the afternoon, a few hours earlier than I planned to, because there was supposedly a big winter storm headed our way, so I hoped if I left early, I could get by before it started. Think it was somewhere around 4 or 5 hours in that the storm hit. The road went from pretty much empty and uneventful to suddenly snow everywhere within minutes. The wind was really bad as well, pushing my car around and throwing snow at my windshield. I didn't feel like I was losing control or anything, though, and with no other cars on the road, I still felt safe driving. However, after an hour of this, it really started tiring me out, mostly from just having to pay so much attention to the road, and the snow started piling up on the road a bit more. My phone suddenly started beeping with a winter storm advisory, and only a couple minutes after that, I lost all service. It was definitely a lot worse than I was comfortable with now, especially because if something were to happen, I'd be stuck without any way to call for help. So I pulled off at the nearest rest stop a few miles down the road. It was an empty, quiet rest stop just in the trees off the highway, with a small, snow-covered parking lot and a service building. There was only a single other car parked on the other end of the lot. It looked like it had been there from before the storm, though, because the roof had a thick layer of snow over top it. Few minutes after pulling in, the storm somehow got even worse. It was a whiteout. I couldn't even see the other car anymore, and the wind was actually pretty scary. I can't imagine anyone could have been driving in weather like this. A long, boring hour went by as I sat and waited in the snowstorm. Eventually, both out of boredom and uncomfort, I decided to get out and head inside the rest stop service building to use the bathroom. As soon as I stepped out, the freezing wind and icy snow was almost immediately painful. I hurried up to the building and got in. There was just a small lobby with a few benches, some pamphlets of road maps, and 2 doors leading to the restrooms. Thankfully, the heat seemed to be working in there, so I actually just stayed in the lobby for a minute and warmed up, while looking out the windows at the snow coming down. I could only faintly see the car still parked over there, now with the snow covering the entire windshield. Thought it was strange that it didn't look like it was on. I mean, it was below 0 degrees outside, so not having the heat on would have had them freezing by now. But after a minute, I headed up to the bathroom door and pushed it open. Or tried to. It opened just a crack before slamming back shut. I pushed it again, and that time it barely budged. I took a step back. It wasn't like the door was locked. It was like someone was on the other side, preventing me from opening it. I stared at the door for a second, really just shocked and unsure what to think about that. It was really strange. I thought about just going into the women's restroom instead, assuming if whoever that was in the men's restroom was the only other car at the rest stop, then it shouldn't matter. But honestly, I didn't feel safe being in there any longer. Felt like something wasn't right about this, or that there had to be a reason they were blocking the door like that, and I really did not want to push my luck. So I hurried back out of the building. As I left, I heard the bathroom door swing open, but I didn't turn back to look. I just continued walking through the storm and back into my car. By this point into the storm, the whole rest stop parking lot was covered in snow, and I really wasn't sure if I could even leave. I wanted to, even if to just drive a few miles down to a different place to pull off at, but I didn't want to get stuck trying to leave. So I sat there and tried to wait out the storm. I tried to think of any possible reasons for someone blocking the door like that, but honestly, I couldn't think of anything. Nothing that would explain them knowing I was walking in and already being at the door to stop me from entering. Only a few minutes later, I noticed a shape start emerging from the whiteout, coming in between my car and the building. It was a person, and basically right when he became visible, he stopped walking and just stood right in the blizzard. He looked like he was on the phone talking to someone, and he was facing me. Couldn't tell if he was looking at me though. He paced around that same spot for a minute, still talking to someone on the phone, before he started to slowly make his way closer to my car. Like he would pace a few steps toward me, then stand in the same spot for a bit, trying to make it not obvious. But at one point, when he was much closer, I very clearly saw him looking directly into the car at me. And then, all of a sudden, he had this wide, over-exaggerated smile and started approaching my window. He walked right up to my car and tapped on the window, grinning at me through the glass. I was genuinely terrified, and as embarrassing as it is to say it, I was completely frozen in fear. Like for a moment, I just couldn't get myself to do anything. The man started knocking on the window a little harder, basically hitting it, hard enough that I was surprised it didn't shatter. And then, in the distance behind him, I saw another guy come out of the rest stop building and start running over. I snapped out of it and put my car in reverse. My heart sank when my tires started spinning out. I wasn't moving at all. The guy got closer and closer until suddenly my car jolted back and got traction. I backed out and put it in drive. And in the split second before I drove off, the one man that just got there threw a knife right at the windshield. It bounced off, but put a huge crack right in the middle. I drove out of there and prayed that I didn't lose control or get stuck the whole way down the road. I was sure they would try to follow me, but as far as I know, they didn't. I drove dangerously through the storm until it started to clear up and I had service. It had been so long, though, that the police didn't find either of the men when they got there. But what they did find was the car. It was still right there in the middle of the parking lot, untouched. Despite what I had assumed, it wasn't either of the men's car. It belonged to some other guy that when the police showed me a reference photo, I didn't recognize. And over the next few days, it came out that the man was missing. No sign of him. From what I've heard, he was also on a road trip, and his family believes he pulled off the highway to sleep for the night. But then he wasn't heard from or seen again. Honestly, I think something really terrible happened at that rest stop just before I arrived there. I think one of the men was outside keeping a lookout while on call with the other, letting him know to block the door when I walked in. Had I forced my way inside, I have a really bad feeling of what I might have found, and they probably wouldn't have let me get away either. I was on a road trip from northern Washington to southern Utah to meet up with my family for just a few days around Christmas. For the road trip, I rented an Airbnb along the way. Wasn't looking for anything great. Really just needed a place to sleep. So I found the cheapest place right in the halfway point in Idaho. It was kind of in the middle of nowhere, not near any towns or cities, but it was only a mile off the highway, so it was perfectly convenient for what I needed it for. I left in the morning and started getting close as the sun was going down. The section of Idaho I was in was covered in forest and seemed pretty uninhabited. Not a lot of houses or other places around, except for I guess the Airbnb. After a while of going down the highway, My phone told me to turn off on a very small dirt road. There were no lights or other indications that a path was even there. I drove slowly and carefully for the entire mile down this dirt road until I made it to the cabin. And on first glance, it looked way bigger than I expected. There were no images of the outside on the listing, but it said it was only a single bedroom cabin, so I expected something fairly small. I parked right outside the front. The whole forest around the cabin was dense and dark. I could hear all the birds and animals calling out as the night was coming in. I headed up to the door and legitimately almost had a heart attack when the door suddenly opened. "Didn't mean to scare ya," the man said in an overly friendly voice and with a wide smile. I was still recovering from the scare and confused who this guy was and why he was even here. He explained he was Charlie, the owner of the Airbnb. I think he could still tell I didn't understand, and that's when he said, "Your room is right over here." And I realized what this was. The Airbnb was a room in the cabin, not the whole cabin itself. I couldn't believe I'd made a mistake like that. I was sure it didn't say it was a shared living space. But at the time, and under pressure, I figured with the pictures not having shown the outside and it saying it was one room, it all made sense. I followed Charlie in. He led me down the long hallway all the way to the farthest room on the end of the cabin. The hallway was noticeably dark, didn't have a single ceiling light or lamp or anything. Charlie gave me a key to the cabin and to my room, then gave another big smile and said enjoy, leaving me to settle in. I closed the door and tossed my bag on the bed. I really wasn't comfortable with being out in some isolated cabin in the middle of nowhere with a stranger. But it was an Airbnb. Surely it was fine. And the only reason I decided to follow through with it and stay is because I was just there for a single night. I was gonna chill in the room, get some sleep, and head out first thing in the morning. I tried to not overthink it. I unzipped my bag and started unpacking just the few things I needed for the night. A couple minutes in, Charlie knocked on the room door. It made me jump again, because I never heard his footsteps coming down the hall. It was like he had just been standing there. I walked over and cracked it open. His wide, empty smile was beginning to come off as really creepy, and the overly friendly voice he was faking made it even worse. He asked how I liked the room. I just said it was great, trying to be kind and keep the conversation quick. He nodded and told me to holler if I needed anything else. I said thank you and closed the door, but this time I waited for a second. The guy didn't move for an eerily long amount of time before I finally heard his footsteps depart and walk down the hall. I locked the door. Something about that guy really made me uncomfortable. I knew he could have just been trying really hard to be nice and a good host, but it came off as fake and almost uncanny. I stayed in the bedroom for 30 minutes, staying on my phone and just listening to the cabin to make sure Charlie wasn't doing anything weird. I could hear the muffled sound of the TV in the living room start playing after a while, and so eventually I felt good enough to start getting ready for bed. I set my phone on the nightstand to charge, brushed my teeth, then got in the shower. It was one of those old tub showers that looked honestly disgusting. The shower curtain looked fairly new though, and was one of those blurry, kind of see-through ones. I turned the water on and tried to be quick, but only a minute or so after getting the water running, I heard a slight thump from outside the bedroom, like somewhere in the hallway. I moved my body out of the water and tried to listen. I didn't hear anything else, but for a split second I thought I saw something. like possibly a shadow, move in the bedroom. I saw it through the blurry curtain and immediately opened it and looked out, but didn't see anything. I stood there looking and waiting for a minute, then quickly finished washing off and got out and got dressed. When I walked back into the room, I naturally looked toward the door where I heard the sound from, and felt the blood rush from my face as I saw the bedroom door was cracked open. Not fully wide open, but obviously it didn't matter, because I knew I had locked it. I stood there frozen for a second, then rushed over, slamming it closed and locking it again. Something was seriously wrong with this cabin, and I no longer felt safe at all. Not with Charlie opening locked doors like that. Even just thinking about that stranger walking in with his creepy smile while I was showering gave me chills. I picked up my phone from the nightstand, and while I tried to figure out what to do, I opened the Airbnb app and looked at the listing. I was trying to see if others had reported strange behavior in their reviews. There were only 3 other reviews, giving 5 stars, but honestly, rereading them now, they looked completely fake. And even more unsettling, I realized I hadn't made a mistake at all. The listing said it was a standalone cabin, not some room in a shared residence. Nothing was adding up, or I guess everything was adding up, but in the most unsettling way. I needed to leave immediately. I packed the few things I had into my bag, then went up to the door and put my ear against it, listening to try and hear where Charlie was, and if I could make a quick exit without drawing attention. I heard the muffled TV still playing from the living room, which I knew was right next to the front door. But as I stood there quietly, I started to hear something else. Something soft, coming from inside the room I was in. I slowly turned around. I heard this low, raspy breathing from right where the bedroom closet was. I threw the bedroom door open and sprinted out of there. The living room was empty as I ran past it and right out to my car. I drove dangerously fast down the rugged dirt road until I made it to the highway, and after calling my mom in a panic, she convinced me to make a report with the police. I did, but I'll save you all the unimportant details, because let's just say nothing came from it. His disturbing, creepy behavior wasn't provable, and the only thing he actually got in trouble for was listing the cabin incorrectly on Airbnb. And just to add to the creepiness, Charlie wasn't even his name. Thankfully, the listing was removed for false advertising, and I never saw it get relisted, so hopefully no one else has to go through that like I did. Can't even imagine what would have happened if I didn't leave the cabin that night. This happened in winter, right around Christmas time. I live with my girlfriend, who I'll name as Sarah, and being that we lived pretty far from our families, we almost always went on road trips around the holidays. This year, we were going to Sarah's family's home for Christmas. The drive was just under 11 hours. Usually this drive wasn't too bad, but maybe we just gotten lucky the years before. We packed and shoved all our bags and suitcases into the trunk, then left for the road trip on Christmas Eve, hoping to make it there at night and have all of Christmas Day with her family. First couple of hours were quiet. Think a lot of people had already done their driving for the holiday, so the roads weren't crowded. Eventually, I pulled off at a small gas station to top off the tank and just take a break for a minute before continuing the drive. There wasn't a single other car there. Sarah waited inside the car with the heat on, while I ran inside to pay for the gas and grab us some drinks. The wind was harsh and cold, and the lot hadn't been plowed yet, so there was basically half a foot of snow I had to run through just to get up to the building. I opened the door and walked in, and right away I noticed how quiet it was. I didn't see anyone. I looked around for a second, but figured they were probably in the back or something, and would come out once I was ready. I grabbed a couple of drinks and walked up to the counter, but nobody came up. I called out hello and tried just peeking into the back room, but I didn't see anyone, or even hear anyone. I think the place was actually empty, even though the doors were unlocked and the lights were on. It was strange, but after a couple of minutes, I just put the drinks away and went back outside to hopefully at least be able to use the gas pump. As soon as I stepped out, I saw a guy standing at my girlfriend's window. Looked like he was trying to talk to her, knocking on the window and looking in. He was bundled up in heavy winter clothing, so aside from what he was wearing, I couldn't get a good look at him. I started hurrying over, but as soon as he saw me, he backed up and started quickly walking away. I got up to the car and watched as he continued walking down to the road. He clearly wasn't the missing worker at the gas station, so now I was even more concerned. I got in and asked Sarah what that guy was doing. She seemed a little flustered. She said he came up out of nowhere as soon as I walked in, and all the guy was saying was to roll down the window, constantly knocking on it. He didn't say why or really anything else. Obviously, she found it very creepy and had a bad feeling about it, so she kept the doors and windows locked and didn't respond to him. I didn't even bother staying. I turned on the car and drove out of there, hoping we'd reach another gas station along the way. That place just had an unnerving feeling to it, and neither of us wanted to be there a second longer. Unfortunately, because of that whole thing, we ended up having to take a detour to a different gas station, because along our main route, the next one was too far, and would have risked us running out of fuel in the middle of nowhere and in the freezing cold. And it became pretty clear that things were not going to work out the way we wanted. With the detour and the snow slowing us down, we were way behind. It was well into the night already, and we were still 4 hours away. Both of us were tired and figured we could stop at a cheap motel to sleep at for a few hours and just arrive at the house early on Christmas morning instead. Sarah called her family to let them know, and I found a motel just on the side of the highway, a few miles down. The 24/7 motel sign was still on, but the parking lot was empty. I mean, Christmas Eve night is an odd one to spend at a motel. I pulled in and walked up to the door, feeling relieved to see a clerk inside. I got a small room for the night and headed back out to get our travel bags and get us into the room. We were exhausted and pretty much passed out within 30 minutes of getting inside. I set an alarm for 2 a.m. so that we could get up and make it to our family's house by 6 a.m. I think both of us slept like rocks. I never woke up once during the 5-ish hours we were sleeping. When my alarm went off, I groggily got up, not even wanting to get out of bed. I let Sarah sleep in for a bit while I packed what little we had, then went outside and tossed all the stuff in the back seat. It still looked like nobody else had come by the motel at night. It was incredibly cold, and the wind was awful. It wasn't even snowing that hard, but the wind was blowing all the snow dust up from the ground, making it hard to see. I ran back in and told Sarah it was time to go, then headed back to the front of the building to check us out of the room. I walked into the small office room where the clerk was, but they weren't there. I stood still for a moment, feeling the deja vu of what had happened at the gas station, but this time, obviously, I had seen them earlier. I took a few more steps closer to the desk and again called out, but still nobody was there. However, I saw a bunch of papers all over the floor behind the desk. It looked like the worker had left in a hurry. I felt this really bad feeling start coming over me as I backed away and ran back out to get Sarah. I sprinted down the row of room doors, opening ours and telling Sarah we had to leave right now. She hurried out and into the car while I grabbed what was left, and then also got in. I noticed my hands were shaking as I turned it on, and was just barely able to get the car going through the snow-covered parking lot. It was as I was pulling back onto the highway that I passed the side of the building and just caught sight of a man on the side of it. Even from that quick glimpse, I saw it was the same guy from the gas station, same winter coat and everything. Knowing something was definitely wrong, I got onto the highway and Sarah called 911. We met officers at a gas station 15 minutes away, and this is where it got a lot more disturbing and creepy. One of the officers brought up how impossible it was that the random guy could have been following us without us noticing. And sure enough, he found a tracker stuck right under the back wheel well on our car. The guy must have stuck it there when he went up to our car at the gas station. It took over an hour for separate officers to go to the gas station and the motel, and me and Sarah went pale when they reported back that both workers were confirmed missing. So obviously this guy that was following us had something to do with it. My guess is that he had done something to the worker at the gas station before we arrived, and then when I got there, maybe he thought I saw something that I shouldn't have. So he followed us to probably get rid of us too. Can't say for sure because they never found the guy. Only evidence was a blurry image from a gas station CCTV camera. It definitely was the most unsettling way to spend our Christmas morning. And really, we were thinking about it for the entire holiday week, but ultimately, that seemed to be the end of it. After that week, we got no updates on anything. Unfortunately, I haven't heard anything back about either the gas station worker or the motel worker, so I think it's safe to assume they're both still missing, which makes it even more eerie to think that both me and Sarah could have been still missing as well, had we not gotten out of there. I was on a small vacation over New Year's to see my two brothers and a couple good friends of mine at my hometown. To be perfectly upfront, I never liked my hometown. Moved away as soon as I was able. It was a real small, out-of-the-way town with no cities or even neighboring towns for miles and miles. Everything was outdated and run down, and the only ones living there were people who had been there all their lives. My brothers and friends were the only reason I ever came back to visit. Usually, I'd stay at one of my brother's places for the week, but this year, both of them now had girlfriends that live with them, so I really didn't feel like being the third wheel. The only hotel in the town was a real small family hotel right off the gravel highway. I don't think it even had a name. It was just hotel. I arrived there pretty late. The parking lot was empty except for one old truck. When I walked inside, the lobby was dim, lit by a single lamp behind the counter. An older man, 60s maybe, scruffy beard and hair grown out unevenly, stood up from a chair when he saw me. It looked like I had startled him, or that he wasn't expecting me, but after a moment he said, "Need a room?" His voice was low and rough. He gave me a key and showed me to the room at the end of the hallway. Inside this hotel, it was very old. Not like it was falling apart, but old enough that it felt kind of dirty. The room was small too. Just a bed right in the middle with a TV in front of it. Figured it didn't matter, since I was only going to be here to sleep, and would be spending the days with my friends and family. I left everything packed and took a quick shower, then passed out on the bed. However, I woke up sometime around 3 a.m. to a soft knocking. Not at my door, at the far end of the hallway. I laid there listening to it through the thin walls. Spaced out, quiet, slow knocks. Then silence. Then a few more. It kind of sounded like an old wooden door, opening and closing, the knocks being the low thuds against the door frame. I didn't know what was going on out there, but this wasn't exactly a 5-star place, so I didn't bother caring. I fell back asleep after a while. When I got up in the morning, I went to grab coffee from the lobby before heading out, but the lobby was empty, not a coffee bar or anything. Even the front desk was empty. No sign of the old man or anyone else working there. Felt a little strange, but I shrugged it off and left to go spend the day with my brothers. I was out for a long time. I think it wasn't until 9-ish that I got back to the hotel. Once again, just that one truck was in the parking lot. When I walked in, the lobby lights were off now, and the whole place felt colder. Still no signs of the old man. I walked down the hallway and into my room, locking the door and changing into more comfortable clothes for the night. And that's when I heard it again. Those strange thud or knocking sounds. It was only a couple before it stopped and was quiet again, but this time it sounded like it was right outside of my room. I went over and cracked the door open just enough to peer into the hallway and see what was going on. Only had a second to notice the door right next to mine was slightly open now before the man's voice called to me from down the hallway. It made me jump. He called out asking me to come down to the lobby, and before I could respond, he walked back out of view of the hallway. He didn't say why or anything. It was super weird, but I felt like I had to go down there and see what he wanted. Maybe there was a problem with my room or something. I walked down the hallway. The place was still quiet. I knew I had to be the only one staying in this hotel right now. When I got to the end, he wasn't there. The lobby was still dark, and I didn't even hear him walking around anywhere. I got a really bad feeling standing there in the lobby. I didn't like knowing that I was alone in there, even if he likely didn't have any bad intentions. After a few seconds, I decided to just hurry back to my room. I stayed up a bit later that night, but never heard any signs of the man being inside the hotel. It's like he just left after I saw him at the end of the hallway. In the morning, I went and saw my friends and mentioned the strangeness of the hotel I was staying at. All of them were confused. They seemed to all agree that they had heard something about that hotel closing down a year or two ago. None of them were sure though, and said if I was staying there, then surely they were wrong. I spent the whole day with them, heading back late in the night. As I drove there, I couldn't help but think about the possibility that the place was actually vacant or shut down. But it just couldn't be. The lights and water in my room worked, and the old guy working there wouldn't be there to give me a room if it wasn't open. I pulled in to the same site as the previous 2 nights, an empty parking lot with just the one truck. I walked inside a little more cautiously this time. Still, the lights were mostly off, and I heard nothing at all. I started walking down to my room, and when I got up to the door, I froze. It was cracked open. I creaked the door open further. The room was dark, and honestly, I was terrified to even enter. I saw my suitcase, which was still mostly packed, and decided to quickly run in and grab it. Everything else I had left in there was worth leaving, like a toothbrush and random stuff like that I didn't care about. Definitely not enough to risk staying there any longer. I started to hurry out of there. Something in my gut told me I needed to get out of there immediately. I got down to the end of the hallway and into the dark lobby, when I happened to look back at where I came from. I don't know if I'd unconsciously heard something, or if I just had a feeling to. But when I looked back, I felt my whole body go numb. I saw the old man peering out from the doorway to my room, staring down at me. I ran to my car and drove to one of my brother's places. He urged me to call the police, just to get the whole story straight. Even if it was just a worker snooping around my hotel room, it was worth reporting. But what we found was a lot worse. My friends were right. That place was vacant. Not necessarily abandoned, though. It was still connected to the power grid and everything, but the owners of the land shut it down and moved away, and sort of just left it there. And when the cops searched the place, they found no signs that the old man was there. Even that old truck that was there on all 3 days I was there was gone now. And actually, it seemed like the police didn't even believe me. Like they thought I was a crazy person that was using the abandoned hotel as a free place to stay, and just hallucinated the guy. They didn't say that outright, but I could just tell by the way they were talking to me. It made me feel even worse about that whole town. I stayed at my brother's place for the next few days, then gladly left town and headed back home. Absolutely the strangest, most confusing, and legitimately horrifying experience I've ever had. Thinking back on it is almost worse, knowing what I was in the middle of, and how close I probably was to never being seen again, had I not realized something was wrong and left in a hurry. I took a short vacation last Christmas to see my family over the holidays. Plan was to meet some of my family at our cabin a few hours south of the city, right in between where me and the rest of my family lived. It was just a quiet mountain cabin my parents have had for years, that we often met up at for vacations or getaways. A little wooden home with a fireplace and a view of the woods. It was always peaceful, and really that was all I wanted. This wasn't going to be some big Christmas get-together either. My family was small, just me, my parents, and my sister. But since I was driving alone, I decided to plan for 5 days. 4 to spend with my family, and 1 that I could spend there alone. I arrived 3 days before Christmas, late in the afternoon. The sky was already darkening when I parked, and the woods behind the cabin were already covered in a haze from the sun setting. I only had a couple hours before getting to bed, so I just walked through the cabin, unpacked, and took a nice long shower, then slept through the night. I think it had been over a year since the last time any of us from the family had been to the cabin, but because I had barely been there before by myself, there was no way to know if anything was really wrong with it. I figured I'd just let my parents deal with that when they got here, though. And from a quick glance, nothing seemed to be off about the place. It was as nice and peaceful as I'd hoped. And the following day was my one and only full day to spend alone at the cabin, so I wanted to make it worthwhile. I got up early, made a hot cup of coffee, and took it with me on a walk around the woods. There was a rugged footpath from all the walks we'd taken over the years. It was maybe a 2-mile loop just through the trees and back to the cabin. That morning, it was fairly cold outside, and there was a thin layer of snow on the ground that had fallen overnight. The woods were very quiet. Really, all I heard was wind flowing through the trees. But I only made it half a mile in before seeing some strange scuffs in the snow right on the trail. Thought it might have been a deer or other animal, but further down, there were more clear prints, showing they were shoe prints. Very distinct, too, like they'd been made not long ago. I looked around. Nobody should have been out in these woods, especially this close onto our property. The prints seemed to follow the trail for a while, and as I continued along it, I just started getting uneasy about it and decided to turn back. I was sure it was nothing, just a hunter walking around, or maybe someone else had a cabin near there, but I wanted to be safe and just head back. I definitely didn't want to run into anyone out there in the middle of nowhere. That was pretty much all that was on my mind the whole walk back, trying to figure out why someone was out there. Finally seeing the cabin, I walked up to the front door and almost choked on my coffee. There were shoe prints going right up to the door. It came from the other way, where the trail ended and came back around. Obviously, they weren't there before, so that means whoever was out here had been right outside the cabin just minutes ago. I frantically looked around, feeling like someone was watching me. But all I saw was an empty, snowy forest all around me. After a few seconds, the tension got too much for me to handle, and I quickly got inside and locked the door. My heart was racing. The chances of this happening was nearly zero, and on the one day that I was here alone, was even less likely. It felt like this couldn't possibly be a coincidence. And the thing is, when I left the cabin to go for a short walk, I didn't lock it. Because why the hell would I need to, for just going on a quick walk on my own property out in the middle of an isolated forest? I felt extremely uncomfortable, but I really hoped I was just overreacting. Like whoever that was just saw the trail led to a cabin, and checked through the windows if it was abandoned or something, then just left when they saw I wasn't. It was still creepy as hell though. I called my parents to let them know about what was going on, just in case. They said that maybe I should spend the night at a hotel and wait for them to get there tomorrow, just so I wasn't alone. My mom also seemed more nervous about it than I was, which is saying a lot. But I decided to stay. I was still going to be cautious, not opening the doors anymore and just staying inside for the rest of the day. Pretty bad decision looking back on it. The day dragged on. I wanted this to be a peaceful, relaxing day alone, but knowing that I might not be alone out there made it the complete opposite of relaxing. I was more paranoid than anything. I sat in the living room by the fireplace for most of the day, drinking coffee to keep me awake. Even though I was tired, I didn't want to sleep. Closing my eyes didn't feel safe, like something could happen if I didn't stay alert. Slowly, the day started coming to an end and the sun started getting lower, and eventually it was dark out again. An eerie calmness fell over the woods around the cabin. It was just the crackling fireplace lighting up the small room I was in. Even after all those hours, I was still thinking about those footprints coming up to the cabin. And as I got more and more tired, knowing I needed to sleep at some point, I was desperate for a way to somehow know if I was safe, like a sign that they were really gone. And somehow it wasn't until that moment that I thought about checking to see where the footprints led after reaching the cabin, like if they turned around and went back toward the trail, or just off into the woods, which would have been incredibly creepy. I got up and creaked open the front door. It was pitch black and silent outside. The woods out front were too ominous to look at without getting chills. I looked down at the still frozen shoe prints in the snow. Even just seeing them again gave me a really bad gut feeling. I looked for the shoe prints leading away, and kept looking, and slowly I could feel my face getting pale as I couldn't find any shoe prints leading away from the cabin. They went right up to the door, then just disappeared at the doorway. And that's when it hit me. Me leaving the cabin unlocked, and the footprints not leaving. I slowly turned around, looking into the dark, flickering orange glow inside the cabin from the fireplace. Someone was in here with me. Someone had been in there with me all day. Almost right on cue, I heard a slight creak down the hall. I leaned my body forward, enough to look down the hall toward the bedrooms. My bedroom door was open, and a man was in the middle of the hall, slowly creeping toward the living room I was in. As soon as he saw me, he froze for a moment, before bolting down the hallway at me. I took my keys off the wall and sprinted to my car, getting in and leaving immediately. By the time I felt far enough to look in the mirror, the cabin wasn't even lit up by my back headlights anymore. It was just a void of black behind me. I got into the nearest town and had police take my report and check out the cabin. Of course, the man wasn't there when the officers looked. They did find some scuffs on the floor in the bedroom, though, inside the small stand-in closet. So they think he was hiding in there all day, waiting for me to go to bed and fall asleep. But what really makes it that much creepier is that's all we know. No idea who he was or what he wanted to do to me. I mean, what if it was someone I knew, that knew I'd be going to that cabin alone for a day? The coincidence of it all seems like a lot, but I really hope that's all it is, and that I'll never have to encounter that man again. I was spending the weekend alone at my cabin-style house on the edge of town. It wasn't isolated in the middle of nowhere. There were other houses around, but they were spaced out enough that you could go days without seeing anyone around. I never got visitors, like solicitors or neighbors. The houses in this neighborhood were the kind people drove past without even thinking about it, because unless you looked intently, you probably just saw an endless forest of trees. It was winter, right after a heavy snowfall, so everything felt quieter than usual. A thick blanket of snow covered the whole area, and the woods behind my house looked deeper and darker than they usually did. I didn't mind being alone out there for the most part. The house was cozy, with lots of big windows, a stone fireplace, and just overall that nice cabin feeling. It was the whole reason I moved there. The first night, nothing weird happened until late. I stayed up watching YouTube videos in the living room, kind of half asleep by midnight. After a while, I turned off the TV and headed to my room. It was a one-story home, so my bedroom sat right at the end of the hallway. The thing about the bedroom is that it matched the rest of the home, having these massive floor-to-ceiling windows along the wall, and even a sliding glass door that opened toward the woods. Because the home was in a private location, with just the woods on all sides and no close neighbors, it made sense, I guess. But it did feel strange sometimes. Even just seeing my reflection in the glass at night would startle me, thinking someone was standing out there. But this night was different. As I turned off the lights and crawled into bed, I heard something. This soft cracking sound coming from outside. Not like an animal or the typical forest noise. This was louder, like someone stepping on a thick branch. A couple seconds later, it happened again. I sat up and looked toward the large window. Because the lights were off in my room, I could see outside through the glass pretty well. I stared for maybe 30 seconds before something moved in the solid darkness between the tall pine trees. Not a shape I could describe, just a quick shift of a shadow between two trees. Like someone leaned out of view, or leaned into view. I couldn't tell. Everything was still after that. After minutes of waiting and staring out there, feeling nerves building up in me, I started to think I might have just imagined it. Like my eyes were just seeing shapes in the dark. But I didn't move for a long time. Eventually, though, I got up and double-checked the sliding door was locked. then got back in bed. After that, it took me forever to fall asleep. Every 30 seconds, I felt like I had to open my eyes and look out the window again. But every time, I saw nothing. The next day was strange. Nothing outright happened, but everything felt off in a way I couldn't explain. I'd constantly get that subtle, uneasy feeling, like someone was standing just out of sight, staring in. I kept glancing at whatever window was behind me, half expecting to see eyes looking in. I never did, but the feeling didn't go away. As it got later and became dark again, snow began coming down again, which eased my senses a bit. I think it made it even more unlikely anyone would be outside lurking around when it was cold and snowy, so I tried not to overthink. Around 10, I was watching TV in the living room, wrapped up in a blanket by the fireplace. The glow of the TV screen lit up most of the house, so I didn't even realize how dark it was inside until I left the couch to get a soda. And as I walked through the main hallway, I noticed the light in the far room, the small den with bookshelves, was off. I could have sworn I left it on earlier. I usually always kept it on because it provided a nice ambient light, so the house didn't feel like a shadowy cave. I went over and quickly flipped the light back on, figuring nothing of it, and getting my soda and sitting back down. I was maybe back on the couch for a minute, having just unpaused the TV, when I happened to glance over my shoulder. I wasn't even trying to check anything. It was just one of those automatic glances you do for no reason. But the light in the room was off again. I could feel the blood rush from my face. I stood up and walked down the hallway, just enough to see the switch from where I was standing. The switch was in the off position, physically flipped down. I just stared at it. Someone was in that room, and it was like they were trying to lure me in there. I started to back away. My phone was charging on the nightstand in my room, and my car keys were by the front door. I knew I needed to get both and leave immediately. I quietly moved to the other hallway and into my bedroom, grabbing my phone, but not before seeing something shift behind the glass. I looked up, and at first all I saw were faint footprints going through the snow behind the window, until it led my eyes to a large figure. A man, standing just a couple feet behind the window. He was entirely covered by the dark, but I knew he was looking in at me. I sprinted back down the hall toward the front door, getting my keys, and hearing not one but two sets of footsteps on the other side of the house. I opened the door and ran to the side driveway where my car was. As soon as I got in, I saw that same figure come barreling around the house and running toward my car. I turned it on and fled for the main road, seeing his figure standing where my car just came from and watching me drive away. It took a little over 30 minutes for officers to arrive on my property. What they found was horrifying. Multiple windows were shattered, and the whole house looked like it had been destroyed on the inside. Doors and cabinets ripped from their hinges, furniture flipped over, and dents and tears in the walls. I told the police that I'd heard two people inside and saw one man outside, but the condition they left the house in, it was impossible to know how the two got in quietly while I was at home all day. I stayed in a hotel for weeks after that, getting the house repaired and putting it up for sale. I couldn't get over the feeling of knowing three people had been stalking me for who knows how long. And had I not escaped, I can't even imagine the horrible, disturbing things that would have happened that night. Even now, I have nightmares of me in that hallway, walking toward the room with the light off, knowing what was waiting for me just outside of view of the doorway. I was on a road trip from basically the East Coast to the West Coast. I had plans to meet up with some friends, but was also taking the road trip just for fun. I'd only ever flown to individual cities in the West, so I was excited to check out or at least drive through some of the other areas. I had the whole route planned, but on my third day of driving, I entered a part of the highway that was under heavy construction. My maps told me there was a road closure ahead, and directed me to get off the highway and onto a small one-lane road that went right along the highway. Now, right away, I did notice that no other cars seemed to get off when I did. They all were turning and going a different way. However, I figured it was just that they were all headed in a different direction. Maybe there was a big city that way or something. I didn't know because I didn't know the area. I wasn't worried about it because my maps told me to go this way, and it was pretty much just going right along the highway anyways. Only difference was it was a smaller road and a lower speed limit. I think I got on this road around 7, so it was already dark. I should mention this trip was just toward the beginning of winter, and it was snowing a bit during this part of the road trip. Anyway, as I got further and further down this road, I only became more aware of just how empty it was, and eventually it veered away from the main highway and out into what looked like nothing. I had no idea where it was leading me, but my maps said I was still going the right way, and the estimated time to arrive at my destination looked normal, so I figured I was still good. After an hour at least, I saw a cluster of lights in the distance. Looked like a small town, which was great because I was running low on gas. Few minutes later, I was close enough to see that this cluster of lights really was only maybe 15 to 20 buildings. None of them had anything more than a couple of small outdoor lights on. The small town looked very old and run down, and honestly deserted. Sure, there were some lights on, but it still felt off. I drove up to the gas station, just some small vacant building on the edge of the town. There was a flickering light on the overhang, and the pump seemed to be working, so I got out and started filling the tank. Oddly, there was actually another car at the gas station. It was a small grayish SUV, parked at the pump across from me. Its windows weren't tinted or anything, so I could clearly see through them. Looked like there was a bunch of stuff packed in it, suitcases and whatnot, looking like they too were on a road trip. But nobody was inside of it, and nobody was outside of the car either. Wasn't sure where they were, because the gas station building was clearly closed, and this SUV definitely didn't belong to this town. It looked like they were just passing through. I started to feel a little more uncomfortable. The town had this really eerie feeling to it. It was also real quiet out there. The dead silence gave me shivers every time I looked out at the darkness and the empty streets. To make things worse, the gas was filling up extremely slow. Took a whole minute just for a single gallon, which probably wasn't even enough to get over to the next town, wherever the hell that was. And I think it was after being there for 2 minutes, waiting in the dark silence, that there was a sudden scream in the distance. It was a male voice screaming for help. I was so on edge already that it made me jump back and slam my shoulder against the gas pump. I stared out in the direction it came from, but it was a complete blackout. There was something about the voice that didn't feel right. I took a few steps away from my car just to get a clearer view of the area. Then the man yelled again. He was way closer this time, like somewhere in the dark right outside of the gas station. I looked out there for just about 20 seconds, listening to the eerie silence that followed his voice, before sudden movement in the side of my view caught my attention. It looked like someone running through the dark toward the back of the gas station, and almost as soon as I saw that, something else moved in another part of the dark. I felt like I was going insane, and my gut told me to get the hell out of this town immediately. I quickly started taking the pump out. As I did, I could hear multiple people running around in the grass just outside of the gas station. I hurried into my car, and that's when several guys came out of the dark, clearly all coordinated in whatever plan they had. They began sprinting toward me just as I got it into drive. I sped out of there and straight back onto the deserted road. I keep thinking about that empty car that was there, seeming to be on a road trip just like I was, probably getting there just a few minutes before I did. Was the person calling out for help in the dark attacked by the same men I saw? Or maybe the person calling out for help is what lured the other driver out there, only for who knows what to happen. There wasn't even a police station at that town, so although I reported the situation, I have no idea if they even drove out there to look. I never got any updates on what really happened at that town.